the wind off the Sea of Galilee arrives before anything else. It comes low across the water, cool and salt-tinged even in the warmer months, carrying with it the faint smell of fish and wet stone and the cooking fires of the villages that ring the shore. The hills that rise from the northwestern edge of the lake are gentle by the standards of the region, broad and grassy in the early spring, terraced in places by generations of farmers who had made their peace with the slope. Wildflowers grow there in the weeks after the winter rains, red and yellow and blue against the pale limestone, and the view from the higher ground is wide enough to take in the full arc of the lake below, the distant eastern shore, the toy-sized fishing boats threading between them. It is, by any measure, a beautiful place. And it is the kind of beautiful that asks nothing of you. It does not impose. It simply holds you. Somewhere on those hills, in the late 20s or very early 30s of the first century of the Common Era, a man sat down. He had walked up from the shore with a crowd pressing around him, and at some point on the ascent he found a place that suited him, turned, and lowered himself to the ground. His disciples settled close. The crowd spread out across the hillside below and around him, some standing, some sitting on the grass, some craning for a better view from the edges. And then the man opened his mouth. What followed was roughly 20 minutes of walking to reach that hillside, and the better part of an age to fully understand what was said there. To make sense of what happened on that hill, and of the words that have survived the hill by 2,000 years, it is necessary to first understand the world that assembled around him. Not the Sunday school version of that world, scrubbed clean and arranged for instruction, but the actual world, fractious, anxious, layered with debt and resentment and competing visions of what God wanted and what Rome would allow, and underneath all of it, a longing so old and so bone-deep that most of the people who carried it would have struggled to name it clearly. They knew they were waiting for something. They were less certain what that something looked like. The region of Galilee in the late 20s of the first century was Roman, in the way that a conquered land is Roman, technically administered, practically complicated, and perpetually aware of the gap between the two. The Emperor Tiberius, who had come to power in AD 14 following the death of Augustus, governed from Rome through a network of client rulers and appointed prefects. Judea to the south was under the direct authority of a Roman prefect. From around AD 26, that prefect was Pontius Pilate, a man whose instincts for political management rarely matched the situation he was managing. Galilee itself, where Jesus spent most of his public ministry, was governed not by Rome directly, but by Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who held the title of Tetrarch, meaning ruler of a quarter, a title that tells you almost everything about the fragmented nature of power in the region. Herod Antipas was, in the way of client rulers everywhere, a man caught between two loyalties that were fundamentally incompatible. He needed Roman approval to hold his position, and he needed to avoid provoking his own population past the point of open revolt. He had recently made his situation considerably more complicated by divorcing his first wife to marry Herodias, who was both his niece and the former wife of his half-brother, an arrangement that John the Baptist had declared publicly and loudly to be unlawful under Jewish teaching. Antipas had John imprisoned for this and would eventually have him executed. The execution of John the Baptist was not a distant political event for the people who gathered on that Galilean hillside. It was recent. It was local. It was the kind of thing that made a man careful about which prophet he followed and how loudly he followed him. The taxation system that sat over Galilee in these years is worth understanding in some detail, because it shaped the lives of nearly everyone in the crowd on that hillside, and shaped them badly. The Roman system did not collect taxes through a large, efficient bureaucracy. It collected them through a practice called tax farming, in which the right to collect taxes in a given region was sold to individuals, who then recovered their investment plus profit by collecting from the population. These collectors, the people the Gospels call publicans or tax collectors, were not strangers assigned from Rome. They were locals. They knew their neighbors. They knew who had a good harvest and who had a bad one, who had just sold a field and who was 3 payments behind. And because their profit came from the margin between what they collected and what they owed Rome, the incentive to press hard was structural, not personal. The system produced exploitation as reliably as a mill produces flour. On top of the Roman tax burden sat the temple tax, the tithe owed to the Jerusalem priesthood, and the various local levies and dues that accumulated around any system of organized governance. Scholars who have studied the economic conditions of first-century Galilee suggest that the total tax burden on an ordinary peasant family may have been anywhere between 30 and 40% of their annual income in a good year, with no mechanism for relief in a bad one. Debt was not an exceptional condition in Galilee during these decades. It was the ordinary condition of ordinary life. The crowd that gathered on that hillside contained people who owed money they could not repay, people who had lost family land to creditors, people whose entire economic horizon was bounded by subsistence and the fear of sliding below it. When Jesus would later speak of forgiveness of debts, these were not metaphors his audience needed to strain to understand. The political instability of the region was matched by its religious complexity, and the two were not separate problems. They were the same problem wearing different clothes. Jewish life in first-century Galilee was shaped by a set of institutions and traditions that had been evolving for centuries, and the evolution had produced not unity but argument, not clarity, but a proliferation of interpretations, each backed by its own authority and each in competition with the others. The Pharisees are the group most frequently mentioned in the Gospel accounts, and they are also, thanks largely to those accounts, the group most frequently misunderstood. In popular imagination, the Pharisees are the villains of the story, rigid, hypocritical, more interested in rules than in people. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either, and the parts it gets wrong are important. The Pharisees were, in their origins and in much of their practice, a serious and sincere religious movement. They believed that the law of Moses was the word of God, and that obeying it completely was the path to faithfulness, both for individuals and for Israel as a whole. They had developed an elaborate system of interpretation and application, the oral law, which was designed to extend the written Torah's commands into every area of daily life. They argued about how to carry out these obligations with the genuine passion of people for whom the question actually mattered. They were also, for the population of Galilee, somewhat remote figures of considerable social authority. A Pharisee in a village was not a neighbor who happened to have strong religious opinions. He was a representative of a tradition that claimed to define what faithfulness looked like, and that claim carried weight. People who could not manage the full demands of Pharisaic observance, the washing rituals, the tithing requirements, the Sabbath restrictions, were not simply people with busy lives. They were, in the accounting of that tradition, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, a phrase that carried a quiet but persistent social stigma. To be Am Haaretz was to be religiously insufficient, to stand at a distance from the fullness of the covenant. It was not a comfortable place to stand, and most of the people in that Galilean crowd had been standing there their entire lives. The Sadducees, the other major party named in the Gospel accounts, were a different kind of institution altogether, where the Pharisees were a movement of lay piety with roots in the villages and synagogues. The Sadducees were an aristocratic priestly class centered on the Jerusalem temple. They were the establishment in the fullest sense of the word, connected to wealth, to the high priesthood, to the mechanisms of formal religious authority. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead or in the authority of the oral tradition that the Pharisees had built up around the written Torah. They were conservative in the technical sense, holding to the Pentateuch alone, and conservative in the political sense, having made a workable accommodation with Roman power that protected their position. They were not, as a group, much present in the daily religious life of Galilee. But they governed the temple, which meant they governed the center of Jewish worship, which meant they governed something that mattered to everyone. And then there were the scribes, the professional interpreters of the law, experts in a tradition of legal reasoning that was centuries old and extraordinarily dense. A scribe who taught in the synagogue, expounding the Torah and the prophets for his community, was a trained specialist operating within a recognized framework of authority. His authority came from his mastery of tradition and from the chain of transmission that connected him back through his teachers to the teachers before them. When he said that a particular law meant a particular thing, his claim to be heard rested on that chain. This is a crucial detail, and we will return to it. Galilee had its own particular religious texture, distinct from the Jerusalem establishment in ways that the Jerusalem establishment noticed and sometimes looked down upon. It was a mixed region, the very name echoing the older designation Galilee of the Gentiles, a land where Jewish and non-Jewish populations had lived in proximity for generations, where Greek was spoken alongside Aramaic in the market towns, where the great trade routes from the east passed through, and where the purity standards that the Pharisees in Jerusalem considered basic were harder to maintain and less consistently observed. Galileans spoke with an accent that marked them immediately in Jerusalem. They were considered, by certain southern sensibilities, to be somewhat rough around the edges in matters of religious practice. This was not entirely fair, but it was consistently held. Into this world, Jesus had been moving for some time before the moment on the hillside. He had grown up in Nazareth, a small Galilean village of no particular distinction, and the years before his public ministry are almost entirely invisible to us, which is itself a kind of information about how unremarkable they appeared to those around him. He was a craftsman by trade, and the Greek word used to describe his father's occupation, and by implication his own, covers a range of work with wood and stone that shades from carpentry toward general building labor. He was not a professional scribe. He had not studied under a recognized rabbinic authority in the formal chain of transmission. He had no institutional standing in the religious establishment of his day, no position, no title, no recognized school that vouched for him. And yet by the time he walked up that hillside, he had been teaching in the synagogues of Galilee for some months, and people had been stopping what they were doing to listen to him. More than that, they had been leaving what they were doing to follow him. The crowd that spread across the hillside that day was not an accidental gathering. These people had come because word had traveled, and the word was specific. Something was happening with this man from Nazareth, something that was worth walking a considerable distance to hear for yourself. The form of his teaching is important, and it is worth spending some time with it, because the form was itself a statement. In the rabbinic tradition of first-century Judaism, teaching was a seated activity. A rabbi sat when he taught, and his students stood or sat around him, depending on the formality of the occasion. The posture was not a matter of comfort. It was a signal. When a teacher sat down and opened his mouth to expound the law, he was doing something with a recognized shape, announcing by his posture alone that what followed was authoritative teaching, the kind that deserved to be received and held and remembered. When Matthew's Gospel notes that Jesus, seeing the crowds, went up on the mountain, and when he had sat down his disciples came to him, the seated posture is not incidental detail. It is the first word of the sermon, delivered without a syllable spoken. The comparison with Moses is not accidental, and would not have been missed by anyone in that crowd with a working knowledge of their own tradition. Moses went up to the mountain and received the law. The mountain in the Jewish imagination was not simply a geological feature. It was where the human and the divine met at an angle, where God condescended to be heard, where the covenant was spoken and the law was given. Sinai was the defining mountain, but the type it established kept recurring. When Jesus went up the hill and sat down to teach, those who knew their scripture were already completing a sentence whose beginning they recognized. The question was what the ending would be. The disciples came to him. This phrase, which appears to slide past without weight, carries more than it seems to. In the Greek of Matthew's Gospel, the word translated as disciples, the word mathetes, means literally learners, people in the process of being formed by a teacher. The relationship between a rabbi and his disciples in the first-century Jewish world was not primarily a relationship of intellectual instruction. It was a relationship of formation. The disciple did not simply learn what the rabbi taught. He learned how the rabbi thought, how the rabbi moved through the world, how the rabbi handled a question, how the rabbi prayed, how the rabbi read the text. He was, in a sense, trying to become a copy of his teacher, to have the teacher's way of understanding reality reproduced in him. The disciples did not just attend the sermon on the hillside. They received it as their primary formation, the definitive statement of what their teacher held to be true about God, about human beings, about the life that was worth living. And then the crowd, the multitudes, the text calls them, a word that gestures towards scale without pretending to a census. These were people from across the region, some of whom had followed him from Galilee, some from the Decapolis, some from Jerusalem and Judea, some from beyond the Jordan. They came with the same mixed motives that any crowd brings to any public figure: curiosity, desperation, hope, skepticism, the desire to see a miracle, the desire to be told that their suffering had meaning, the desire to hear someone speak plainly about things that the official religious culture seemed to have wrapped in such elaborate qualification that the plain meaning had become unreachable. Understanding who these people were requires sitting for a moment with what their daily lives actually involved, because the sermon they were about to hear was not addressed to an abstraction. It was addressed to them, specifically, people who woke before dawn to tend animals or work fields that may or may not still be legally theirs, who carried water from wells that served whole villages, who ate bread and olives and dried fish, who knew the feel of limestone dust and sun-cracked earth, who argued with their neighbors about property lines and water rights, who buried children at rates that modern life has mercifully made unfamiliar, who navigated a world in which Roman soldiers could requisition your labor on the road for a mile without asking, in which the very coinage in their pockets bore the face of a man their tradition would have called idolatrous, in which the gap between their daily reality and the covenant promises of their scriptures, the promises of a God who loved them, who had chosen them, who had delivered them from Egypt, was wide enough to ache. The ache was not simply economic. It was theological. If God had chosen Israel, where was God now? If the covenant was real, why did Rome sit on the throne? If the law was the path to blessing, why did the devout suffer while the corrupt prospered? These were not abstract theological puzzles. They were the questions that arrived every morning with the light, questions that the Pharisees answered one way and the Zealots answered another way, and the Sadducees, by and large, chose not to answer at all because the status quo suited them well enough. The Zealots, a movement whose organizational boundaries are harder to draw than later accounts sometimes suggest, held that armed resistance was the faithful response to Roman occupation. God would not restore Israel to its covenant inheritance while Israel accommodated itself to pagan domination. The only righteous path was to fight, to trust that God would honor the fight and deliver his people as he had delivered them through the Judges, through the Maccabees, through every crisis in the long story of the nation. Among the 12 disciples who had attached themselves most closely to Jesus, at least one, Simon, carried the name Zealot as an identifying marker. How literally that name described his politics is uncertain, but it suggests that the discourse of resistance and liberation was not foreign to the inner circle on the hillside that day. The longing that shaped this crowd, in other words, was not a vague spiritual yearning. It was a specific, historically grounded, politically charged expectation. They were waiting for the kingdom of God. The phrase had deep roots in the Jewish tradition. and carried a range of meanings that different groups and individuals would have weighted differently: a restoration of Davidic monarchy, a reversal of Roman power, a purification of the land, a resurrection of the righteous dead, a final judgment that would set the historical record straight. Some expected a military Messiah who would drive Rome into the sea. Some expected a priestly figure who would purify the temple and restore proper worship. Some expected an apocalyptic intervention so total and so final that human politics would simply become irrelevant. The common thread was that the present arrangement was not the final word, that God had promised something better, and that the promise was overdue. It is into this precise atmosphere, weighted with all of this, that Jesus walked up the hillside and sat down. And before we arrive at what he said, we need to sit for a moment with how he said it, because that too was a kind of content. Matthew records the opening of the sermon with a formula that appears elsewhere in the Hebrew tradition, a formula that the audience would have recognized as a signal, and he opened his mouth and taught them. The phrase, opened his mouth, is not a casual description of speaking. In the literature of the ancient Near East, in the Psalms, in the prophetic writings, in the wisdom traditions, the phrase carries a specific weight. It marks the utterance that follows as significant, as considered, as something the speaker has held and weighed before releasing it. When Job finally speaks, after 7 days of silent suffering, the text says he opened his mouth. When Balaam is compelled to bless Israel rather than curse it, the text says he opened his mouth. When an angel appears to Daniel with a revelation, the text says he opened his mouth. The formula is a way of saying, what follows is not casual speech. What follows is what this person has been brought here to say. Jesus was not, in the technical sense of his day, an authorized teacher. He had not trained under a recognized master in the formal chain of transmission. He held no institutional position within the religious establishment. When the scribes taught, they taught by citation. Rabbi so-and-so said, quoting the tradition, anchoring their interpretation in the accumulated weight of those who had come before. The authority of the tradition was the teacher's authority, borrowed and wielded on tradition's behalf. This was the recognized grammar of religious authority in first-century Judaism, and everyone in that crowd understood it, had grown up hearing it, had absorbed the sound of it in the synagogue every Sabbath. What Jesus did was different enough to stop people. He did not cite, he did not borrow. When he spoke the law, he spoke it in his own name. I say to you. Not Rabbi Hillel said, or it is written in the tradition of the fathers, but I say to you. This was, by the standards of his world, an extraordinary way to hold yourself when speaking about the law of Moses. It was either the posture of a man who had lost his mind, or the posture of a man who believed, with a completeness that left no room for hedging, that he had the authority to say such a thing. The crowd sensed the difference without necessarily being able to articulate it. Matthew notes at the sermon's end that the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. This reaction tells us something about the teaching. It tells us the crowd recognized a quality in it that was not the quality of teaching they were accustomed to hearing. The physical hillside itself has accumulated centuries of tradition and a certain amount of productive uncertainty. The site venerated since at least the 4th century as the Mount of Beatitudes sits on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, between the ancient town of Capernaum, which served as a kind of base of operations for the early part of Jesus' Galilean ministry, and the fishing village of Tabgha. The hill is gentle enough that a crowd could spread across it without difficulty, with natural acoustic properties that allow a speaker near the top to be heard at a reasonable distance below. A church now sits at the summit, built in the 1930s, 8-sided in honor of the 8 Beatitudes. Its circular colonnade framing a view of the lake that has not changed in 2,000 years in any way that matters. Whether the sermon, as Matthew records it, was delivered in a single sitting on a single occasion, or whether it represents a gathering together of teachings given across multiple occasions and settings, organized by Matthew into its present shape, is a question that scholars have spent considerable energy on without arriving at a universal agreement. The parallel sermon in Luke's Gospel, sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain, shares significant material with Matthew's account, but differs in setting, in length, and in certain specific formulations. These differences do not cancel each other out. They suggest that the teachings gathered here were teachings Jesus returned to, developed, repeated in different contexts, and that both Matthew and Luke are doing something more than transcription. They are each telling the story of what Jesus taught in a way that serves the particular community they are writing for, and the particular aspects of that teaching they most want their readers to hold. Matthew, writing primarily for a Jewish Christian audience deeply formed by the traditions of Hebrew Scripture, has a specific and consistent interest in presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, the one toward whom the whole prior history of God's dealings with Israel has been pointing. His organization of the sermon, with its 5 great blocks of teaching mirroring the 5 books of Moses, with Jesus ascending the mountain as Moses once ascended, with the lawgiver speaking in his own name rather than borrowing authority from tradition, is not accidental literary architecture. It is a theological argument, made in form before it is made in content. By the time Jesus opens his mouth to speak the first word of the sermon, Matthew has already told his audience, in the language of structure and setting and symbol, what kind of figure they are dealing with. The crowd that assembled that day was, to a significant degree, a crowd of people who had been told in various ways and by various authorities that they were not quite enough, not quite observant enough, not quite clean enough, not quite connected enough to the inner mechanisms of the covenant to be confident of standing well with God. The Pharisaic tradition had its internal logic and its genuine piety, but its effect on the Amharites, on the ordinary working people of Galilee who could not maintain the full weight of its demands, was often a low-grade religious despair. The temple cult in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish worship, and the place where the great festivals gathered the nation, but it was also expensive to access and administered by a priestly aristocracy whose priorities were not always the priorities of subsistence farmers in the north. The synagogue offered local community and the reading of Scripture, but the reading was in the hands of teachers whose authority came from a tradition that itself required constant mediation. What many of the people on that hillside had, underneath all of it, was not the warm confidence of the religiously satisfied, but the quiet anxiety of the religiously uncertain. They knew the promises of the covenant. They had heard them read aloud every Sabbath. They were less certain whether the promises applied to people like them, ordinary people with ordinary sins and ordinary debts and ordinary lives that fell comprehensively short of the ideal that the law seemed to be describing. The question they were carrying up the hillside, whether or not they would have put it in these words, was something like, "Does any of this include us?" The man who sat down on the grass and opened his mouth was about to answer that question. The answer would shock some of them, offend others, and for a third group, the group that had run out of other options, it would land like cold water on a hot day, like a door opening in a wall they had stopped believing had a door. The son of a Galilean craftsman, trained in no recognized school, holding no institutional position, speaking in his own name about the highest things, was about to deliver what 2,000 years of readers have not stopped arguing about, not stopped being astonished by, and not stopped finding in some way or another unbearably demanding and unbearably beautiful at the same time. He had sat down. His disciples had come close. The crowd had spread across the grass. The wind moved in off the lake. He opened his mouth. The first word he spoke was a word the crowd knew. They had heard it in the synagogue, in the Psalms, in the wisdom literature, in the blessings that dotted the tradition like waymarkers on a familiar road. The word in Greek is makarios. In Hebrew, the underlying term is ashra. It appears at the very opening of the book of Psalms. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. It appears in the wisdom books, in the prophets, in the liturgical poetry that shaped the inner life of every Jew who had grown up hearing Scripture read aloud. The crowd knew the word. What they did not know, not yet, was what he was about to attach it to. And when he told them, the effect was something that does not translate easily across 2,000 years, because the shock of it depends on knowing what the word was supposed to mean and what kinds of people it was supposed to describe. Makarios did not mean happy. This is the first thing to understand, because in the translations that most people encounter, the word is rendered as happy or blessed, and both words carry modern freight that distorts the original. Happy describes a feeling, something interior and fluctuating, something that can be present one morning and absent by afternoon. Makarios described a condition, an objective state of affairs, a verdict rendered about a person's actual situation in the world. In its oldest Greek usage, the word belonged to the gods. The immortals were makarioi because they existed above the reach of suffering, want, and death. Human beings could be called makarios when something of that divine security and flourishing attached itself to their lives. The prosperous man was makarios. The man with sons and grandchildren around his table was makarios. The man whom the gods had favored, whose affairs prospered, whose enemies were brought low, whose name commanded respect, he was makarios. This was not merely a Greek idea. The Hebrew tradition had its own version of the same logic, and it was written into the covenant itself. The book of Deuteronomy had been explicit about it. Obey the law, and the rains will come in their season. The harvests will be abundant. Your enemies will flee before you. Your children will be many. Your storehouses will overflow. The blessing of God in this framework was something you could point to. It had weight and measure. It showed up in the barn and the field and the family roster. And conversely, suffering was the condition of the person who had fallen short, who had broken the covenant, who had failed in some way that had brought the withdrawal of divine favor. This is not a caricature of the tradition. It is what the text says. The ache of Job, the anguish of the Psalms of lament, the entire tradition of wrestling with the suffering of the righteous, all of it arose precisely because this framework was so deeply embedded that when the righteous suffered, it felt like a contradiction that demanded a theological answer. Into this world, with its Greek understanding of makarios pointing toward divine favor manifested in worldly success, and its Jewish covenantal understanding of blessing pointing toward material prosperity and national flourishing, Jesus opened his mouth, and the first description he attached to the word makarios was this: the poor in spirit. The Greek word for poor in this sentence is tokos, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not a gentle word. Greek had another word for poverty, penes, which described the condition of the laboring poor, people who worked and had enough to survive but nothing more. Subsistence, struggle, the permanent low-grade anxiety of having just enough. Tochos was worse than that. Tokos was the vocabulary of the beggar, the destitute, the person who had nothing at all to fall back on, who crouched rather than stood, who depended entirely on the generosity of others for survival. When the crowd heard tochos, they heard the extreme end of poverty, the kind that had stripped away every resource and every dignity. And Matthew records that Jesus said, tochos tu pneumati, poor in spirit. The addition of those two words changes the frame entirely, because it is not addressing the bank account. It is addressing something interior, something about the condition of a person's relationship to their own sufficiency. The poor in spirit are those who have arrived, whether through suffering or self-knowledge, or the simple grace of clear sight, at the recognition that they have nothing to bring before God that would constitute a down payment on His favor, no store of righteousness accumulated through careful observance, no inherited merit derived from ancestry. No track record of correct religious performance. Nothing. The spiritually poor are those who stand before God with empty hands, not because they have given up, but because they have finally understood that the hands were always empty. The self-sufficiency was always an illusion. This was a deeply uncomfortable thing to say to a crowd that contained Pharisees who had spent their entire adult lives building precisely that store of righteousness. It was also for the Amharets, for the ordinary people who had never managed to maintain the full weight of Pharisaic observance, and who had consequently lived with a background hum of religious inadequacy, something more than uncomfortable. It was vertiginous. The condition they had been implicitly told was a deficiency, their inability to stand on their own religious accomplishment, the very poverty of their spiritual position. Jesus was calling the entry point for the kingdom of heaven, not a problem to be solved before they could approach God, the approach itself. And the promise attached to this poverty was not future. It was present. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not will be, not shall be when things improve, not one day when they have sorted themselves out. Is now in this condition. The kingdom belongs to them already. Before the crowd had fully absorbed this, he continued, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." The Greek word is pentaunce, a present participle, describing not a past experience of grief, but an ongoing one. Those who are, right now, in the sustained condition of mourning. It is a heavy word. It is the word used for grief over the death of the beloved, for the mourning that tears clothes and covers the head with ash. But in the prophetic tradition it carried a second register as well, one the crowd would have recognized, the mourning of those who grieved for Zion, who carried inside them a sustained ache over the distance between what Israel was called to be and what it had become, over the desolation of the temple, over the apparent silence of God, over the condition of a people who had been promised a covenant and were living under Rome. This mourning was not self-pity. It was the grief of people who understood the world clearly enough to see what was wrong with it, and who felt that wrongness rather than anesthetizing themselves against it. The world runs from this kind of grief with tremendous energy. The management of feeling, the avoidance of sustained sorrow, the preference for distraction over lament. These are not inventions of modernity. Every generation has developed its own mechanisms for not having to feel the full weight of things. What Jesus was saying in this second beatitude was that those who refused to look away, who sat with the grief of the world's brokenness and their own complicity in it, who could not manage a comfortable indifference, were in precisely the right position to receive something. They shall be comforted. The passive voice here is a Jewish theological device, the divine passive, designed to avoid speaking the name of God directly while making clear who is the actor. God will comfort them. The one who comforts is the one who was promised in Isaiah, to comfort all who mourn in Zion. The logic is not that grief is good in itself, or that suffering is to be sought. It is that the comfort offered in the kingdom is a comfort that can only be received by those who know they need it, and knowing you need it requires having sat with the grief long enough to feel its full weight. The comforted are those who first allowed themselves to mourn. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The word praus, rendered as meek, is one of the most persistently misunderstood words in the entire sermon. For the modern ear, meek carries connotations of passivity, timidity, the absence of spine. The meek person is the one who shrinks, who does not push back, who makes no demands. This is almost exactly wrong. In the Greek world, from which Jesus' audience inherited the word, praus was used of a horse that had been broken and trained, an animal of considerable power and speed that had learned to submit that power to the direction of its rider. It was not the absence of strength. It was strength that had been surrendered to a greater purpose, brought under discipline, made available for use by someone other than oneself. The promise attached to this quality is a direct and unmistakable quotation from Psalm 37. The meek shall inherit the earth. The psalm from which this comes is a sustained meditation on a problem that every attentive reader of the Hebrew tradition had wrestled with. The wicked prosper, the righteous suffer. The powerful take what they want and seem to face no consequences, and the faithful wait and wait and wait. The psalm's answer to this problem was not a polished philosophical resolution. It was an instruction. Do not fret. Trust God. Wait. Refrain from anger. For the wicked will be cut off, and those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. The meek, those who refused to seize the earth by force, who submitted their power to divine direction rather than deploying it for self-preservation, would in the end receive what the violent had taken. In a province occupied by the most militarily effective empire the ancient world had yet produced, in a region where the land itself had been carved up by conquest and held by force, this promise had a specific political texture that was impossible to miss. The earth did not belong to those who had seized it. The earth belonged to those who trusted the one who made it. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. The pairing of hunger and thirst is not decorative. In the world of first-century Galilee, where most of the people on that hillside had experienced genuine, sustained, physical hunger, where water was not reliably available and drought was a real and recurring catastrophe, to say that a person hungered and thirsted for something was to say that their whole body oriented itself toward it, that its absence was not an inconvenience but a physical emergency, that obtaining it was not optional. The intensity of the metaphor was legible to everyone in that crowd in a way that it is not equally legible to people who have never missed a meal in their lives. What they are said to hunger for is dikaiosine, righteousness. This is the first of several times the word appears in the sermon, and it carries two registers simultaneously that the Greek holds together even when translation tends to split them apart. Dikaiosine means personal moral rectitude, the quality of being right before God, being the person one is called to be. And it means justice, the right ordering of the world, the state of affairs in which things are as they should be between human beings, in which the poor are not crushed, in which the powerful do not exploit, in which the covenant relationships of mutual care and faithfulness are honored. A person who hungers for dikaiosine is simultaneously hungry to be made right themselves and hungry for the world to be set right. These are not two separate appetites. In the biblical imagination, they are the same hunger pointing in two directions. The promise is shortasthesantai. They shall be satisfied, filled, the same verb used for the satisfaction of physical appetite after a full meal. Not partially relieved. Not left with a manageable residual longing. Satisfied. This was an extraordinary claim in a world where neither personal righteousness nor social justice seemed anywhere near arrival. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. The Greek word eleimones, merciful, comes from eleos, which in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures most often renders the Hebrew word hesed, and hesed is one of the great load-bearing words of the entire Old Testament, a word so dense with meaning that no single English word captures it. It is covenant faithfulness, loyal love, the quality in God that keeps him from abandoning his people even when they deserve abandonment, the persistence of affection against all discouragement. When God describes himself to Moses as abounding in hesed, he is not describing a pleasant personality trait. He is describing the structural principle of his relationship with Israel. He will not let go. Mercy in the Roman world was not a virtue in the way that courage, wisdom, or justice were virtues. The Romans admired clementia, the magnanimity of the powerful toward the defeated, the generosity of the conqueror in not killing the conquered when he could. This was an aristocratic virtue. It presupposed that you were in a position of dominance and chose not to press it all the way. What Jesus was describing was something categorically different. Eleos moved toward the weak, not from a position of superior power condescending to spare them, but from a kind of solidarity, from the recognition of shared vulnerability, from having received something that one then found it natural to pass on. The promise of this beatitude is deliberately reciprocal. They shall receive mercy. Not as a transaction, not as payment rendered for services delivered, but as a description of how God's economy works. Those who have genuinely been opened by the experience of receiving mercy, who have not managed to keep it locked inside as a private transaction between themselves and God, but have found it moving outward through them into the world, find themselves living inside something larger than their own generosity. The flow of mercy is one direction. It goes where it finds an opening. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The heart, cardia, in the Hebrew and Greek traditions that shaped this crowd, was not primarily the seat of emotion. It was the seat of the will, the center of the self where decisions were actually made, where the true allegiances were held, where the person that one actually was lived. Beneath the person one presented to the world, the pure in heart were not those with the correct ritual purity, not those who had performed the washings and observed the food laws and completed the prescribed observances. They were those whose interior life was undivided, whose wanting pointed in one direction, who were not maintaining a public performance of faithfulness while privately orienting themselves towards something else entirely. Psalm 24 had asked, "Who may ascend the hill of the Lord and stand in his holy place?" and answered, "He who has clean hands and a pure heart." The hill of the Lord was the Temple Mount, and the question was about access. Who was permitted to approach the sacred presence? The answer reached past the ritual requirements and pointed to something interior. Jesus takes this tradition and sharpens it to a point. The pure heart is not established by ritual performance. It is the undivided will, the single-pointed orientation of the whole person toward God, the absence of the kind of double-mindedness that performs righteousness externally while wanting something else entirely on the inside. The promise attached to this quality is the most staggering of all the promises in this series. They shall see God. In the Hebrew tradition, to see the face of God was at once the deepest human longing and something that the tradition regarded as impossible in this life. Moses asked to see God's glory, and the answer was that no human being could see God's face and live. God showed Moses his back, and the experience left Moses' own face shining so intensely that he had to wear a veil when he came down from the mountain. To see God was the eschatological destination of the righteous, the ultimate fulfillment of the covenant. Jesus says it is the inheritance of those whose hearts are undivided. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. The word eirenopoioi is a compound that appears nowhere else in the New Testament, and its construction is important. Not peace lovers, not peace keepers, not the peaceful, but peacemakers, those who actively make peace, who bring it into being where it did not previously exist. The eirene they make, like the shalom it translates, is not the mere absence of conflict. It is wholeness, the flourishing of all relationships between human beings, between the human and the divine, between persons and the communities that form them. Shalom is the condition in which nothing is broken that should be whole, and making it requires active effort in a world that consistently moves in the opposite direction. The promise is that they shall be called sons of God. And the word sons here is not about gender. It is about character resemblance. In the Hebrew tradition, to be a son of something was to share its essential nature, to resemble it in the ways that mattered. The sons of the prophets were those who shared the prophetic calling. A son of Belial was someone whose character corresponded to corruption. To be called a son of God was to be recognized as one whose nature corresponded to God's, whose way of being in the world resembled the divine way of being in the world. And what the tradition said about God's nature was that he was, before everything else, the one who pursued reconciliation. The entire arc of the Hebrew Scriptures, from the moment the relationship between God and humanity fractures in the garden, is the story of God sending people, messengers, prophets, deliverers, trying to repair what had broken, trying to restore relationship with those who had walked away from it. The peacemaker does not merely resemble a subsidiary divine attribute. The peacemaker resembles the central movement of God's entire history with the world. In a province occupied by Rome, in a world where the only peace most people had experience of was the Pax Romana, maintained by legions and enforced at the point of a sword, the identification of the peacemaker as the one who resembles God most closely was a statement of breathtaking radicalism. The generals who had established the Roman peace were not the sons of God. The people doing the slow, dangerous, unglamorous work of building reconciliation between enemies, of refusing to allow broken relationships to stay broken, of carrying the cost of bridge building on their own bodies. They were. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The word didiogmenoi is in the perfect passive, those who have been persecuted and remain in the condition of having been persecuted. This is not a prophylactic about future possibilities. It is a description of people in the crowd whose experience already included being targeted, harassed, excluded, or actively harmed because of the shape of their convictions. The qualifier is critical, for righteousness' sake. The beatitude is not about suffering in general, not about persecution for any reason, but specifically about the experience of being targeted because of one's orientation toward dikaiosine, the same word from the fourth beatitude. The bracket is deliberate. The first and eighth beatitudes share the same promise. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and the word they share as a hinge is righteousness. The kingdom belongs to the spiritually destitute and to the persecuted, and both are defined by their relationship to righteousness. This repetition of the identical promise is not an accident or a rhetorical flourish. It is a structural signal, the kind that a tradition trained on Hebrew poetry would have recognized immediately. The device is called an inclusio, a beginning and ending that use the same material to form a bracket around everything inside. The first 8 Beatitudes, held between 2 identical promises about the kingdom of heaven, form a single unit. They are not 8 separate conditions that each independently qualify a person for 8 separate blessings. They are a portrait, a description of a single way of being in the world, and the portrait is of someone who is poor in spirit, who mourns, who is meek, who hungers for righteousness, who extends mercy, whose heart is undivided, who makes peace, and who consequently suffers for it. These qualities are not a checklist. They are a character. And then Jesus shifted. For 8 Beatitudes he had spoken in the third person. Blessed are they. Now he moved into the second person, and the shift is jarring in the best possible way. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. The phrase "on my account" lands with a weight that the previous Beatitudes had not prepared the crowd for. Every previous Beatitude had described a quality or condition: poverty of spirit, mourning, meekness, righteousness, mercy, purity, peacemaking. These were things that could theoretically be evaluated without any reference to Jesus at all. A person could be meek in the context of any tradition, or purely of heart in a dozen different religious frameworks. But the 9th Beatitude changes the grammar entirely. Blessed are you when you are persecuted, not merely for righteousness, not merely for any good quality, but for my sake, heneken emu, because of me. This is a claim of a different order. It places the person of Jesus at the center of what faithfulness means. It says that the kind of persecution the crowd needs to worry about is not just the persecution that comes from being good or just or honest, but the persecution that comes specifically from being attached to him. It is the first moment in the sermon where Jesus moves from describing the shape of the kingdom to identifying himself as the reason people will suffer for entering it. And it is placed here, at the culmination of the Beatitudes, precisely because what it claims is so large. A teacher in the Jewish tradition who said these things was not making a religious recommendation. He was making a claim about his own nature. "Rejoice," he says to them. "Be exceedingly glad." The Greek agaliasthi is not a mild encouragement toward positive thinking. It is the word used for the leaping, ecstatic joy of those who have seen something they had given up hoping to see. "Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." The reward is not the point of the suffering, not the payment that makes the suffering worthwhile in a transactional sense, but the assurance that the suffering has meaning within a larger economy than the sufferer can currently see. And then, the reason. "For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." This final clause is another claim wrapped inside an apparent historical observation. Jesus places the disciples of the 9th Beatitude in direct succession with the prophets of Israel. Not analogous to them, not inspired by them, not following in their general footsteps, in the same line, persecuted for the same reason, belonging to the same story. The persecution of the prophets was not random. It was the response of a religious establishment to people who spoke an inconvenient truth in the name of God. To say that the disciples will be persecuted for the same reason, in the same way, in the same tradition, was to say something about the nature of the truth they carried and the source from which they carried it. Taken together, the 9 Beatitudes constitute a revolution in the understanding of what it means to be blessed. The revolution runs in 2 directions simultaneously. Against the Roman world's assumption that divine favor was visible in power and prosperity and social status, and against the surface reading of the Hebrew covenant tradition's assumption that obedience produced material flourishing. Both of those frameworks located the blessed person in a recognizable position of social success and divine approval. Both made the blessed person someone you could point to, someone who had arrived. Jesus pointed at a different set of people entirely. He pointed at those who had nothing to offer, who were actively grieving, who had surrendered their power to divine direction, who ached for a world that was not yet, who extended loyalty and love to those who did not deserve it, whose interior lives were not divided by competing allegiances, who were spending themselves in the slow work of building reconciliation, and who were suffering specifically for their allegiance to the one speaking. These were the blessed. It would be easy to sentimentalize this, to make it a kind of spiritual consolation prize, a reassurance for the unfortunate that God loves them too. But that reading drains the Beatitudes of most of their force, because what Jesus was saying was not that God loves the unfortunate, though he does. He was saying that these people in these conditions are the ones in whom the kingdom of heaven is actually present and moving, not the ones waiting for it to arrive, not the ones who will be compensated for their suffering when things are eventually set right, the ones in whom the kingdom is already at work, already established, already operative. The kingdom of heaven does not belong to them in the future. It belongs to them now, in the poverty, in the grief, in the hunger, in the suffering. This was not pessimism. It was not a theology of victimhood or a celebration of misery. It was a claim about where God actually stands in the world, about which direction history is actually moving, about which human experiences are already participating in the life of the age to come, and which are merely the impressive furniture of an age that is passing. The Roman Empire, with its legions and its eagles and its deified emperors, was the furniture of an age that was passing. The woman weeping in a Galilean village for her dead child, the farmer 3 payments behind to the tax collector, the disciple who had left everything to follow a rabbi with no institutional standing. These were the ones in whom the movement of God was alive. The crowd on the hillside heard all of this before he said anything else. They heard 9 statements that assembled a portrait of a life that looked, by every standard their world had given them, like failure. and over each element of that portrait he placed the word Makarios, the word that belonged to the gods, the word that described the prosperous and the powerful and the divinely favored. He did not argue for this. He did not explain his reasoning or build a case. He stated it with the seated authority of a man who was not borrowing the weight of tradition, but speaking from some place inside himself where the truth of it was simply obvious. The crowd had been told in various ways and by various authorities what a blessed life looked like. Now they were hearing something else. And the words were still settling on them, still making their way through the layers of assumption and expectation, and received wisdom when he continued. He did not pause to let the Beatitudes be absorbed, did not invite questions or wait for the crowd to finish the internal argument his first words had already started. He moved directly from describing what kind of people belonged to the kingdom to telling those same people what they were, not what they should aspire to be, not what they might become if they worked at it, but what they already were. The grammar is declarative, present tense, flat and unambiguous. He looked at the fishermen and the farmers and the debt carriers and the grieving and the marginalized gathered across that Galilean hillside, and he said, "You are the salt of the earth." It is worth staying with the word "are" before moving to the word "salt," because the "are" is itself doing significant work. Jesus had not said, "Strive to be salt." He had not said, "If you keep the Beatitudes faithfully, you may one day become salt." He had said you are, in the same direct declarative voice he had used 9 times already when attaching Makarios to people the world had never thought to call blessed. The identity he was conferring was not earned or conditional. It was announced. And the announcement, in the tradition of Hebrew speech, carried creative force. When God spoke things into being in the creation account, he did not describe what was already there. He called what was not yet present into existence by naming it. There is something of that register in the way Jesus speaks to this crowd. He names them as salt, and in the naming he is calling them to discover that the name is already true. Salt, in the world of first-century Galilee, was not a flavoring in the way we primarily think of it now. Salt was survival. Before refrigeration, before the technologies that allow modern people to store food across seasons without much thought, salt was the primary mechanism by which meat and fish were preserved against rot. A fishing economy, like the one that operated on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, depended on salt absolutely. The catch that could not be eaten immediately was salted and dried, and the salted fish of Galilee were traded across the region precisely because they could endure the journey. Without salt, the fish rotted. With it, the catch became a resource that could feed people who never set foot near the lake. Salt also appeared in the ritual life of Israel in ways that the crowd on the hillside would have known from childhood. The covenant between God and Israel was described in the book of Leviticus as a covenant of salt, an enduring, unbreakable bond, salt being the substance that preserved against corruption and so became the symbol of permanence. Every grain offering presented at the temple was to be seasoned with salt. It was not optional, not a cultural preference, but a requirement written into the law. Salt, in this framework, was not decoration. It was the marker of covenant faithfulness, the substance that consecrated the offering and confirmed the relationship between the worshiper and God. And salt had value in the Roman world, in ways that modern people, accustomed to buying it for almost nothing, tend to underestimate. The Latin word salarium, from which the English word salary derives, preserved the memory of a time when salt was worth transporting, worth trading, worth receiving as part of one's pay. Roman soldiers, according to at least some ancient accounts, received a salt allowance as part of their compensation. The salt routes of the ancient world were genuine trade arteries. Salt was not a luxury, but it was not trivially cheap either. It was a substance that people understood to have real importance in the sustaining of real life. When Jesus told the crowd that they were the salt of the earth, he was reaching for all of these registers simultaneously: preservative, purifying, covenantal, valuable. The salt of the earth was not a decoration on the world's surface, but a substance that kept the world from rotting. The disciples, and those who would join their movement, were not being appointed to a role of cultural ornamentation or religious aesthetic. They were being described as the element that arrested decay, that preserved what was worth preserving, that marked the covenant between God and the world in the visible stuff of daily life. And then, immediately, a warning. He did not let the image rest in its grandeur. If the salt loses its savor, he said, with what will it be salted? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. The chemistry of salt, in its pure form, is stable. Sodium chloride does not lose its saltiness. But the salt that most of the people in this crowd had handled in their lives was not pure sodium chloride. It was quarried from around the Dead Sea and from salt deposits in the region, and it came mixed with other minerals, with gypsum and other compounds that looked similar but were chemically distinct. When this impure salt was exposed to moisture, the sodium chloride could leach out over time, leaving behind a whitish powder that looked to the eye remarkably like salt, but that had lost the one quality that made salt useful. You could not resalt it. You could not restore what had leached away. The only use for it was as a kind of road gravel, thrown on paths and courtyards to harden the surface underfoot. The warning embedded in the image was one the crowd could see with physical clarity. It is possible to look exactly like what you are supposed to be, to maintain the external appearance of the thing, while having lost the interior quality that made the thing worth being. The unsalty salt looked like salt. From a distance it was indistinguishable from the real thing. But it had lost the one property that gave it value, and no amount of further effort could restore that property from the outside. The concern is not about the world losing its saltiness. The concern is about the salt losing its pop. He moved immediately from the earth to the sky, from the ground under their feet to the light above their heads. You are the light of the world. In the tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures, light belonged to God. In the creation account, God's first act was to call light into being, and in the final vision of Isaiah, God himself was the eternal light of the restored Jerusalem, replacing the need for sun or moon. The language of light ran through the entire tradition as a marker of the divine presence. The pillar of fire in the wilderness, the glory that filled the temple, the shining face of Moses. When Isaiah spoke of Israel's calling among the nations, he used the language of light. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Israel, in its calling, was meant to be the place where the divine light was visible in the world, where the character of God was legible to peoples who had not received the Torah and did not know the covenant. Jesus took that corporate calling and placed it directly on the people sitting in front of him. You are the light of the world. Not you represent the light, not you point toward the light, not you may eventually reflect a little of the light if you work at it. You are it. The move is the same as with the salt. Declarative, present tense, identity, conferring rather than aspiration, describing. And then he made the identity concrete with two images. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Every person in the crowd had a relationship with a city set on a hill, because Jerusalem was precisely that, built on elevated ground, visible from considerable distances, its walls and towers catching the light. For pilgrims making their way up to Jerusalem for the great festivals, the first sight of the city from the road was one of the memorable experiences of their religious lives. The city did not hide. It could not hide. Its position made it permanently, inescapably visible. This is what Jesus said the disciples were. Not a hidden community, not an esoteric group whose influence operated invisibly and privately, but something by its nature visible, something whose position in the world made concealment structurally impossible. The second image worked in the opposite direction. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. The Greek word for basket here is modios, a grain measure, a container used to hold a peck of grain, roughly the size of a large bucket. It was a common household object in a first-century Galilean home. And Jesus says, "If you light a lamp and put it under the grain basket, you have not protected the lamp. You have defeated its purpose." You light a lamp, precisely to give light to the room, to push back the darkness, to make things visible that would otherwise be invisible. A lamp under a basket serves no function. It is a lamp that has been prevented from being what it is. He placed the lamp on a lampstand instead, and gave it to everyone in the house. This is the purpose, not the lamp's own illumination, not its own warmth, not its own comfort, but the light it gives to others, the visibility it creates in the space it occupies. You, he told the crowd, are that lamp. And the question implied by the grain basket image is not whether the disciples will one day become light, but whether they will allow the light they already are to function as light must, which is to say, openly, visibly, in full view of anyone who happens to be in the room. And then the purpose of the light, stated plainly. Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. This sentence requires careful handling, because later in the sermon he will say things about the performance of religious duties that sound, on the surface, in tension with it. When he comes to the practice of almsgiving, prayer, and fasting, he will warn against doing these things to be seen by others, against performing righteousness for an audience. Read carelessly. The two statements seem to contradict each other. Shine your light so others can see, but do not do your righteousness to be seen. The resolution lies in the final clause of this sentence, that they may give glory to your Father in heaven. The light of good works has a purpose beyond the works themselves, and that purpose is not the reputation of the person doing the works. The purpose is the visibility of God, the recognition by those watching that the source of what they are seeing is not human ingenuity or human virtue, but something that has come from elsewhere. The good works are transparent in the sense that they point through themselves to something behind them. When the visibility of the works draws attention to the person performing them, to their own virtue or generosity or spiritual achievement, the lamp has been pointed at itself rather than at the room. The distinction between shining your light before others and performing your righteousness to be seen is a distinction of motive and direction. Where is the glory meant to go? With these two images of salt and light, Jesus had established something about the disciples' identity and purpose in the world. Now he turned to a question that the Beatitudes had almost certainly already raised in the minds of the Pharisees and scribes present on the hillside, and quite possibly in the minds of the disciples themselves. The question was about the law. He had spoken of poverty, of spirit, of meekness, of mourning, of the pure heart. He had said nothing yet about observing the commandments, about the oral tradition, about the ritual practices that defined Jewish faithfulness in the eyes of the religious establishment. He had been healing on the Sabbath. He had been eating with tax collectors and sinners, people whose occupational uncleanliness made them social untouchables in Pharisaic practice. He had called fishermen and a tax collector to be his inner circle. He had been preaching about the kingdom of God in a way that did not fit neatly into any of the recognized frameworks. For some of the crowd, and certainly for the religiously trained observers watching him, the question that pressed was obvious. Is this man tearing up the Torah? Is he telling people that the law no longer matters, that the tradition is disposable, that the centuries of careful observance and interpretation were wasted effort? He addressed this question directly, and he addressed it with unusual force. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, he said. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The phrase, do not think, is a small grammatical signal with larger implications. Matthew uses this construction several times in his gospel, and each time it functions as a correction of an assumption the audience actually holds. When Jesus says, do not think, he is acknowledging that some people in the crowd are already thinking exactly the thing he is about to correct. The charge of Torah abolition was not a hypothetical that he preemptively cleared up for the record. It was a charge that was already circulating, already attached to his name in the conversations happening before and after the synagogue services and in the markets and around the wells. He knew it was there. He was answering it. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The Greek word for fulfill here is plero, and it is a word with considerable history in Matthew's Gospel specifically. Matthew uses it more than any other Gospel writer, and he uses it consistently in the phrase, "This happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet." In that context, the fulfillment is not merely a technical prediction coming true. It is the arrival of the thing toward which the prophecy had been pointing all along. The event does not fulfill the prophecy by checking a box. It fulfills it by being the thing the prophecy was always about. The reality that the prophecy was a shadow of, the completion toward which the prophecy was always building. When Jesus says he has come to fulfill the law and the prophets, he is making the same kind of claim. The law and the prophets were not self-contained instructions that had served their purpose and could now be retired. They were oriented toward something. They were a trajectory aimed at a destination. They described, through 613 commands and centuries of prophetic vision, the shape of the life that God wanted, the character of the people God was forming, the nature of the relationship God was building with humanity. Jesus is saying that he is the destination of that trajectory. Not that he supersedes the law, not that he replaces it with something more convenient, but that he is what the law was always pointing at, the fullness of what it was trying to say. He pressed the point further with an image that was, for a crowd of people trained in the Hebrew Scriptures, almost laughably specific. For truly I say to you, he said, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The iota is the smallest letter of the Greek alphabet, corresponding to the Hebrew yod, the letter that appears most frequently in Hebrew text, and that, in its smallest form, is barely more than a flick of the pen, something close to a modern apostrophe. The dot is even smaller. The kerea, meaning literally a little horn, the tiny serif or distinguishing mark that differentiates one Hebrew letter from a similar-looking one. The difference between a dale and a resh, for example, two Hebrew letters that share the same basic shape, comes down to a small extension on one corner. Remove the mark, and the letter changes. Change the letter, and the word changes. Change the word, and the meaning changes. Jesus was saying that the law was preserved down to its orthographic details, down to the marks that distinguished one letter from another, down to the smallest possible unit of scriptural text. Nothing would pass away. Nothing would be lost, or discarded, or quietly shelved, until all had been accomplished. This was not the language of someone preparing to water down the tradition. It was the language of someone who regarded the tradition as the Word of God, right down to its smallest strokes. And what followed from this was a ranking principle that cut against a particular Pharisaic habit. The Pharisees, working through the daunting catalog of the law's 613 commandments, had developed a way of organizing them by weight. Heavy commandments, the ones with the most serious consequences for violation, and light commandments, the ones that seemed to carry less immediate gravity. This ranking was a practical tool for navigating a complex system, but it carried a risk. If some commandments were light, it was not a long step to treating them as optional, as negotiable, as not worth the same level of attention as the weightier ones. Jesus pushed back against this habit directly. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same, he said, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. The word relaxes, luo in Greek, means to loosen, to untie, to dissolve the binding force of something. The person who loosens a commandment and passes that looseness on through their teaching is not cast out of the kingdom. They are diminished within it. Least in the kingdom of heaven, still present, still included, but in a diminished standing that reflects the diminished seriousness with which they treated the whole. Conversely, Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. The greatness in the kingdom corresponds to the fullness of one's commitment to the law, down to its smallest and least impressive requirements. And then the sentence that dropped onto the crowd like a stone from a height. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Pause here for a moment and try to hear this sentence through the ears of the people sitting on the grass in front of him. The scribes and Pharisees were not, in the general estimation of this crowd, a group that needed more righteousness. They were the group that had cornered the market in it. A Pharisee in first-century Galilee tithed everything. Not just grain, not just livestock, but the small domestic herbs, the mint and dill and cumin that grew in kitchen gardens. The law required the tithe of agricultural produce. The Pharisees extended it to cover virtually every edible plant in one's possession, because if you were going to observe the law, you observed it comprehensively, right down to the herb patch. They washed their hands before eating in a specific ritual manner that went beyond ordinary cleanliness into a carefully defined ceremony of purification. They observed the Sabbath through a dense network of rulings that specified what counted as work and what did not, how far you could walk, what you could carry, what household tasks fell within and outside the boundaries of the day's rest. The public visibility of this righteousness was not incidental. The Pharisees wore the marks of their observance on their bodies, the tassels on the corners of their garments that the law prescribed as a reminder of the commandments, the phylacteries bound to their foreheads and left arms during prayer, the specific clothing and grooming that marked them as members of a particular tradition of serious observance. They were not hiding their righteousness. They wore it in the most literal possible sense. And the effect on ordinary people who could not maintain this level of performance was not neutral. The Amharets, the people of the land, measured themselves against this standard and found themselves comprehensively short of it. The Pharisees were what thorough, serious, committed Jewish righteousness looked like. Everyone in the crowd knew this. And Jesus had just told them that unless their righteousness exceeded this standard, they would not enter the kingdom of heaven at all. The word exceeded, perisseuo, means to abound beyond, to overflow beyond, to be more than sufficient. Not merely to reach the level of Pharisaic righteousness, not to match it, but to go beyond it so significantly that the comparison is almost uncomfortable to make. The crowd had been told by their entire religious culture that the Pharisees were the gold standard of religious performance. Jesus had not lowered the bar. He had placed it somewhere that seemed, on a straightforward reading, entirely unreachable. This was the moment, for many in the crowd, when the ground shifted under the sermon. The Beatitudes had offered something startling and generous, a description of kingdom belonging that reached people the religious establishment had effectively written off. The images of salt and light had been affirming and purposive, conferring an identity and a calling. But this demand that the righteousness of the disciples must exceed the most visibly righteous people in their world seemed to snap the thread of hope that the Beatitudes had extended. If the Pharisees fell short of what was required, what was left for everyone else? The answer to that question was not given yet. It would not be given in the form of an explicit statement at any single point in the sermon. It would emerge gradually from the accumulating weight of everything he said next, from the treatment of the commandments that the next section would deliver, from the discussion of prayer and interior devotion that would follow, from the analysis of treasure and anxiety, and the single-pointed orientation of the heart. But the crowd did not have the next section yet. They had this sentence, and its landing on them was hard. It is worth being clear about what Jesus was not saying when he demanded a righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and Pharisees. He was not saying that the disciples needed more Pharisaism, more external observance, a more comprehensive ticking of boxes, a more elaborate attention to the distinctions between heavy and light commandments. He was not describing a competition in which the disciples needed to out-Pharisee the Pharisees, to tithe even more carefully, to extend the washing rituals further, to observe the Sabbath through an even denser network of specific applications. That reading, which would have left the crowd simply overwhelmed and the sermon practically useless, misses what he was building toward. The righteousness he was describing operated at a different level entirely, and the clue to where that level was had already been given in the Beatitudes. The pure in heart, those whose interior life was undivided, whose will pointed in one direction, who were not maintaining a performance of faithfulness externally while wanting something else entirely on the inside. The meek, those whose strength had been surrendered to divine direction rather than deployed for self-preservation. The poor in spirit, those who had stopped pretending they had anything to bring. The righteousness that exceeded the Pharisees was not the same kind of thing, done more thoroughly. It was a different thing, operating at the level of character rather than conduct, at the level of what a person actually is and actually wants rather than what they can be observed to do. The Pharisaic system was, in its internal logic, entirely coherent and in many ways admirable. It took the law seriously. It refused to treat the commandments as negotiable. It worked hard to bring every area of life under the influence of Torah. But its operation was necessarily external, because external behavior is the only thing that any system of observation and evaluation can actually assess. You can measure whether a person tithed the cumin. You cannot measure whether their heart was in it. Jesus was heading toward the interior. He was describing a righteousness that began where the Pharisaic system could not reach, and that produced the external behavior as an overflow, not as a performance for an audience, not as a strategy for securing divine approval, but as the natural expression of a character that had been formed from the inside out. This is what fulfillment of the law looked like. Not the abolition of its demands, but the arrival through a transformation of character at the place where the demands were met naturally rather than strategically, where the love of God and the love of neighbor were not obligations one managed, but the actual shape of one's wanting. The crowd did not have this whole picture yet. They had the framework. Fulfill, not abolish, not a jot or tittle lost. The least commandment matters. Your righteousness must exceed the most publicly righteous people you have ever seen. They had the shape of the demand without yet the substance of how it worked, without the extended teaching about the commandments that was coming next, without the model of prayer and devotion and trust in God that the rest of the sermon would offer. They were holding a standard that seemed impossible and waiting to see what he would say next. The relationship between this section of the sermon and everything that had come before it is structural as well as thematic. The Beatitudes had described a kind of person, internally poor, genuinely grieving, strength under control, hungry for what is right, extending mercy, undivided in heart, making peace, absorbing persecution without retaliation. The images of salt and light had placed that person in the world with a purpose, to preserve, to illuminate, to make the character of God visible in the daily texture of human life. And now the teaching on the law had established the framework within which that person operated, not as someone who had dispensed with the tradition, not as a religious revolutionary tearing up the covenant, but as someone who was bringing the tradition to the fullness of what it was always trying to say, who was living the law from the inside rather than managing it from the outside. The scribes and Pharisees present on the hillside that day, or who would hear reports of the sermon afterward, would have understood with some precision what the charge of exceeding their righteousness implied. It implied that their righteousness, for all its external elaborateness, for all the careful attention to the details of observance, did not reach the depth that the law actually required. This was not a comfortable thing to hear. It was not meant to be. But it was also not an insult to the tradition they had dedicated their lives to maintaining. It was, in the framework Jesus was establishing, the completion of that tradition, the arrival at the destination toward which the tradition had been pointing. He was not saying that the Pharisees were wicked. He was saying that they had not yet reached the place the law was trying to take them. And the direction of that further journey, which would require not more external refinement but a fundamental transformation of the interior life, was exactly where the sermon was about to go. The crowd sat on the hillside, holding all of this, the impossible standard, and the promise of something beyond it, the affirmation of the tradition, and the claim that its deepest purpose had not yet been reached. And he continued. What came next followed a pattern. 6 times, with the deliberate rhythm of a man who has thought carefully about the sequence, he used the same formula. You have heard that it was said. And then, after restating a commandment that every person on that hillside had known since childhood, he added the phrase that set the crowd's teeth on edge and the scribe's hair on end. But I say to you, 6 times. The same structure, the same confident pivot, the same voice speaking in its own name rather than borrowing the authority of tradition. You have heard it said. But I say, no rabbi in the first century spoke this way. A scribe who wished to extend or interpret a commandment would say, Rabbi Hillel taught, or it has been transmitted from the fathers, or the tradition holds. The weight of the teaching, borrowed from the weight of those who had taught it before, stretching back through the chain of transmission to Moses himself, to Sinai, to the voice of God. This is how authority worked in the tradition. Jesus did not borrow it. He held it in himself, and 6 times in succession he demonstrated that he considered his own word sufficient to stand against a received interpretation of the law. The crowd recognized what was happening. They may not have been able to articulate it with the precision of a trained scribe, but they had grown up hearing the rhythm of rabbinic teaching, and they knew when a man was departing from it. Each you have heard it said acknowledged the tradition, honored it, took it seriously enough to engage with it directly. And each but I say to you, asserted that the tradition as it had been received and applied had not yet reached the depth that the commandment was actually pointing toward. He began where the law began, with the most serious of all external offenses, killing. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. The 6th commandment, given to Moses on Sinai, preserved through centuries of Israelite life, and enforced by the courts that the community maintained. It was, in its external form, the clearest possible prohibition. The act of taking another person's life was forbidden and punishable. This was not a subtle or ambiguous command. Its application required no special interpretive skill. Either the person was dead by another's hand, or they were not. But I say to you, he said, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, You fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. The move was surgical. He had not weakened the prohibition on murder. He had traced it back to its origin, and what he found there was anger. The sustained, nursed, cultivated grievance that treats another human being as an obstacle or an enemy, that withdraws from them the basic recognition of their worth, that begins the slow process by which a person becomes, in one's own interior accounting, killable. Murder does not begin with the act. It begins with the moment when another person is first reduced, in the murderer's heart, to something less than fully human, something against which the murderer's own grievance outweighs their personhood. The rhetorical structure he used was borrowed from the graduated court system of Jewish jurisprudence. A local matter went before the local court. A more serious matter went before the Sanhedrin, the high council in Jerusalem. The most serious matters of all involved the ultimate judgment. He mapped the interior states onto these graduated courts. Anger brings you before the local court of moral accountability. The contemptuous dismissal of a person's worth, the word raka, an Aramaic term that evacuated another person of all dignity and meaning, brings you before the council. Calling a person a fool brings you to the valley of burning. That valley was not a metaphor his audience needed, explained. Gehenna, the Greek rendering of the Hebrew Gehinnom, the valley of Hinnom, ran along the southwestern edge of Jerusalem, and its history was layered with the worst of Israel's apostasy. It was there that certain Israelite kings had burned their children in sacrifice to Molech, a practice so horrifying that the prophets could barely find language adequate to their outrage. King Josiah had desecrated the site to prevent any further use of it for worship, and by the 1st century it had become the city's refuse heap, where the waste and the dead animals and the things no one wanted were burned in fires that, according to the accounts of the time, smoldered continuously. It was the image of final rejection, of ultimate disposal, of the end that awaited what was genuinely worthless. To say that a person was liable to Gehenna for calling another person a fool was to locate the stakes of the argument precisely. This was not a minor offense against social nicety. This was a matter of ultimate consequence. The word moros, fool, the Greek word Jesus used, carried a particular charge in the Hebrew tradition beyond its ordinary sense of stupidity. The Psalms of Israel describe the fool as the one who had said in his heart that there is no God, the one who had removed himself from the moral order of the universe by denying its foundation. To call another person a fool in this register was to pronounce a judgment about their standing before God, to declare them spiritually beyond the reach of divine care, to do with one's tongue what the courts of heaven had not authorized. It was to usurp God's role as the judge of human souls, and it was, in Jesus' accounting, the verbal equivalent of the murder it did not physically commit. He did not leave the teaching as an abstraction. He brought it into the immediate texture of daily life with 2 concrete images. If you are about to offer your gift at the altar, he said, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go first to be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. The sequence is precise, and its implications for the religious culture of the crowd were direct. The offering at the temple was the central act of Jewish worship, the moment of approach to God, the place where the human and the divine met in the formalized language of sacrifice and prayer. The obvious assumption was that this act of approach took priority over everything else, that its demands superseded the demands of horizontal human relationships. Jesus reversed the priority. The reconciliation comes first. The worship of God cannot proceed properly over the wreckage of an unreconciled human relationship, because the God being worshipped is the God who created all parties to the conflict, and the conflict itself is an offense against the one you have come to worship. And the urgency of reconciliation extended beyond religious contexts into legal ones. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court, he said, before you arrive before the judge. Before the judge hands you to the guard, and the guard throws you into prison. The practical wisdom here is real, but the spiritual logic underneath it is the same. The broken relationship is a live problem that does not improve with delay. The longer anger is permitted to harden into estrangement, the harder the road back becomes, and the eventual cost of refusing to walk it rises with every day of avoidance. The second antithesis moved along the same track, from external act to its interior origin. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." The 7th commandment, again clear, external, enforceable by the community's legal structures. The act of adultery was visible, its consequences social as well as personal, its prohibition ancient and unambiguous. "But I say to you," he said, "that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The Greek word at the center of this teaching is epithymia, desire, and the verb that governs it is crucial. The person who looks pros to epithymesai autein in order to desire her. The construction indicates intentionality, not the involuntary recognition that another person exists and is physically present in the world, not the ordinary functioning of human perception that notices and then moves on, but the cultivated, sustained, deliberate gaze that has already consented to the desire it is feeding. The distinction matters enormously, and Jesus built it into the grammar of his sentence. He was not describing an involuntary neurological response and condemning it. He was describing the gaze that has already crossed a threshold in the heart, that has moved from noticing to wanting, from awareness to the kind of intending that, if circumstances allowed, would proceed to the act. The already in his sentence is the key word. Has already committed adultery in his heart. The adultery is not a potential future event that the gaze might lead to if left unchecked. It has already occurred in the interior place where the will makes its actual decisions, in the part of the person that the external courts cannot see and the external law cannot reach. The law had defined adultery as an act. Jesus located it at the point in the interior life where the act became, in the language of the will, already chosen. He followed this with the most extreme language in the entire sermon to that point. If your right eye causes you to sin, he said, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. The crowd heard this as what it was: hyperbole in the recognizable tradition of extreme rabbinic illustration, the kind of vivid, almost violent image that a teacher deployed to make certain that the student could not miss the weight of what was being said. The rabbis themselves taught in this mode, and some of their preserved sayings are no less startling in their imagery. Jesus was not prescribing self-mutilation, and no one in the crowd thought he was. What he was doing was calibrating the stakes. The right eye and the right hand were not chosen by accident. In the culture of the ancient world, the right side was the valued side, the side of strength and honor and capacity. The right eye was the better eye, the right hand the stronger hand. These were not the disposable parts. These were the prized parts. And Jesus said, if your most prized capacity is the vehicle of your interior compromise, the willingness to remove it must match the seriousness of what it is enabling. The gangrenous limb does not respond to polite requests. It responds to the knife. And the person who refuses the knife because they are attached to the limb dies of the infection. The severity of the image was proportionate to the severity of the danger it was describing. The third antithesis was the shortest of the 6, and, in the human cost, it implied for the people sitting on the hillside, possibly the most devastating. It was also said, he began, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. This referred to the passage in Deuteronomy that had been the subject of sustained rabbinic debate throughout the generation before Jesus, and that remained contested in his own time. The certificate of divorce, the get, was in its original purpose a protective instrument, a formal document that established that the woman was free, that her departure from the marriage was legal and complete, that she carried no ambiguity about her status into whatever life came next. Without the certificate, a woman's position was profoundly uncertain. With it, she had at least the documented freedom to remarry. The debate among the rabbis was not about whether divorce was permitted, but about the threshold of justification. The school of Shammai read the Deuteronomy passage strictly. Only sexual unfaithfulness on the wife's part constituted adequate grounds. The school of Hillel read it considerably more broadly. A husband could divorce his wife for burning his food, for displeasing him in some way, for finding someone he preferred. The word in the original Hebrew text that defined the permissible grounds for divorce was vague, and the two schools had landed on opposite ends of its possible range of meaning. The practical effect of the Hillelite position, which appears to have been widely followed, was that a woman's security in her marriage depended almost entirely on her husband's continued satisfaction with her, which was not a stable foundation on which to build a life. But I say to you, Jesus said, that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The human reality behind this teaching requires attention. A woman in first-century Jewish society could not initiate divorce. She could not issue the certificate. She could appeal to a court in extreme circumstances, where physical abuse or the husband's failure to provide were so severe that the community was willing to compel him to issue the document, but the initiative was his and the law backed him. If he chose to send her away with a certificate of divorce on the grounds of a burned dinner, she had no legal recourse. She returned, if she was fortunate, to her father's household. If her father was dead or unwilling to receive her, her options narrowed sharply. Remarriage was the most practical path to economic survival, and Jesus' teaching, taken in isolation from its broader framework, seemed to foreclose it. Understanding this requires grasping what Jesus was protecting. He was not placing a new restriction on already restricted women. He was addressing the men who held all the power in the system and telling them that the ease with which they could exercise that power did not make the exercise of it morally neutral. The man who divorced his wife for insufficient cause and watched her remarry had not completed a clean legal transaction that left everyone's moral standing intact. He had set in motion a series of events whose cost was borne almost entirely by someone who had no power to prevent any of it. The certificate made it legal. It did not make it right. And the teaching of Jesus pressed the distinction between legal and right directly against the most casual exercise of male privilege that the tradition had effectively sanctioned. The exception clause, except on the ground of sexual immorality, acknowledged what honesty required, that the marriage covenant could be so fundamentally violated by one party's actions that the other party was released from it. What the teaching refused was the weaponization of the legal process, the use of a provision designed for genuine extremity as a routine tool for managing domestic inconvenience. The woman in this teaching was not an abstraction. She was the specific woman, the person with a name and a history and a set of dependencies and vulnerabilities, whom the certificate had reduced to a legal status, while the human reality of her situation remained as raw and difficult as it had ever been. Again, he said, using the formula that by now the crowd had learned to brace for. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord." The prohibition on false oaths was among the most fundamental of the law's requirements, running from the third commandment through Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy with consistent force. What you swear by the name of God, you keep. And what you swear falsely, you have committed a crime against both your neighbor and the divine name you have invoked as your witness. What had grown up around this prohibition, with the best intentions and the predictable results, was an elaborate system of oath-taking that had, over generations, produced almost the opposite of what the prohibition was designed to ensure. The system distinguished between oaths sworn by the name of God, which were maximally binding, and oaths sworn by the temple, or by Jerusalem, or by heaven, or by one's own head, which various traditions held to be less directly binding on the divine name, and therefore by interpretive extension, somewhat more negotiable. The practical effect was a stratification of speech. Some statements were backed by the full weight of divine witness. Others were backed by a witness the speaker had chosen partly for its relative manageability. You knew, when you heard someone swear by the name of God, that they meant it as fully as they meant anything. You knew less certainly, when they swore by the temple or by Jerusalem, whether the oath held the same weight. This created, without anyone quite intending it, a world in which ordinary human speech had been divided into levels of sincerity. The oath system, designed to guarantee truthfulness in the most serious cases, had inadvertently implied that non-oath speech was a zone of reduced commitment, that the absence of a sworn formula was also the absence of full accountability for what was said. The system meant to elevate serious speech had, by contrast, lowered the standing of all the speech that surrounded it. But I say to you, Jesus said, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. The logic is absolute, and its premises are drawn from the tradition itself. Heaven is God's throne. Isaiah had said so. Earth is his footstool, the same text. Jerusalem is the city of the great King. The Psalms had named it. The world does not contain a single thing that is not already God's, and therefore the world does not contain a thing that can be invoked as a reliable witness in a way that bypasses God. The swearing by secondary things, as though they were independent witnesses one could choose for their relative pliability, was both theologically confused and practically useless. And the swearing by one's own head exposed the pretension of personal autonomy most nakedly. You cannot control whether your hair goes white or black. You are not the authority you are attempting to invoke. Let your word be yes, yes, and no, no, he said. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. The radical simplicity of the demand was its sharpest edge. He was not asking for better oath-taking, more careful selection of the divine name, a more rigorous approach to fulfilling sworn commitments. He was asking for the conditions that make oath-taking unnecessary. A life in which the speaker's word is so consistently reliable, in every context, without any ceremony of enhanced commitment, that the distinction between sworn and unsworn statements does not exist, because all statements are equally honest. The phrase from the evil one pointed to the source of the problem. The need for oaths is not a neutral administrative convenience. It is a symptom of a world in which human speech has been corrupted, in which the baseline assumption of ordinary conversation is that people may not mean what they say, in which the oath is required precisely because unsworn speech has become untrustworthy. The corruption is not incidental. It belongs to a disorder in the human condition that runs deeper than bad habits or insufficient social norms. To live by yes and no alone was to inhabit, in this one dimension of one's life, the integrity of a world restored. He moved now to a principle that the crowd had understood since childhood, because it was written into the law and enforced by the courts and reflected in the common sense of every human society that has ever tried to manage conflict without allowing it to consume everyone involved. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. The lex talionis, the law of equivalent retaliation, appears 3 times in the Torah and represents one of the most significant legal achievements of the ancient world, not because it authorized revenge, which is how it is usually misread, but because it strictly limited it. In a world of blood feuds and clan vendettas, where an offense against one member of a family could trigger a cycle of retaliatory violence that consumed generations, the principle that you may take precisely what was taken from you and no more was a restraint, a brake on escalation, a legal cap on the damage that any single offense could eventually produce. An eye for an eye meant only an eye. You may not take a life for an eye, you may not devastate a family for a tooth. The equivalence was the mercy. But I say to you, Jesus said, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Understanding what he was describing requires understanding the specific nature of the blow he was specifying. A blow to the right cheek, delivered by a right-handed person, almost certainly came from the back of the hand. This is worth slowing down over. The backhanded strike, in the culture of the ancient Near East and in the Roman world that overlay it, was not primarily a physical assault, though it was certainly that. It was an act of social performance, a gesture whose principal content was contempt. A master struck a slave that way. A Roman soldier struck a subject that way. A person of rank demonstrated their dominance over a person of lower rank that way. The blow communicated the hierarchy as much as it communicated the force, and everyone present understood what it was saying. You are beneath me. I may do this to you. Your body is available to my displeasure. To turn the other cheek in this context was not to invite a second blow out of passive submission to abuse. It was to refuse the terms being offered by the blow. The person who turned the other cheek was presenting their left cheek, and to strike the left cheek with the same right hand required a different gesture entirely, the open palm, which was the blow between equals. By turning the other cheek, the person who had been struck was not submitting to degradation. They were refusing to be degraded, insisting by their very posture that they would not accept the role of the inferior that the backhand had tried to assign them, while simultaneously declining to retaliate in kind. The move broke the binary. It was neither submission nor revenge. It was something the system of domination and retaliation had not anticipated and could not easily process. He extended the pattern into legal and political contexts with the same structural logic. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. The coat, the chiton, was the inner garment. The cloak, the himation, was the outer robe, the garment that doubled as a blanket at night. The law of Moses was explicit about the cloak. A creditor might take it as a pledge, but must return it before sundown, because the poor debtor had nothing else to sleep under. The legal protection of the cloak was a recognition of the limits of what the legal system could properly strip from a human being, even in the enforcement of a debt. There was a floor of dignity below which the law would not reach. To give the cloak voluntarily, to hand over the one item that even the law protected, was to make visible without any speech what the legal proceeding was actually doing. The creditor who walked away with both coat and cloak, while the debtor stood in the street in whatever remained, had made the reality of their transaction fully legible to every witness present. The voluntary gift of the cloak did not defeat the creditor. It exposed them by stripping away the legal procedural cover that had made the stripping of the debtor look orderly and justified. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. The Roman practice of compelled labor, angareia, gave a soldier the legal right to impress a civilian into carrying his military pack for 1 Roman mile. The practice was bitterly resented across the occupied territories. It was the weight of empire made literal, the subjugation of the body to the purposes of the conqueror made inescapable. The required mile was obligatory, and everyone knew it. To volunteer the 2nd mile was to introduce an element into the situation that the system of compulsion had not provided for. The soldier whose pack was being carried under legal compulsion understood the transaction perfectly. The soldier whose pack was being carried by someone who had, having completed the required mile, chosen to continue, was in a different and stranger situation. The carrier had become, through the choice of the 2nd mile, something other than a person under compulsion. They had recovered, in the most concrete possible way, the agency that the 1st mile had taken from them. Taken together, the 3 images of the turned cheek, the surrendered cloak, and the 2nd mile share a common structure. In each case, the response Jesus recommends does not meet violence with violence or submission with submission. It does something that breaks the logic of the situation, that acts from a freedom the person exercising power did not know the subjected person possessed, that refuses to be defined by what is being done to them. This is what "do not resist" an evildoer actually meant in the world Jesus was describing. Not the passive acceptance of whatever comes, but the refusal to allow the evildoer's action to determine the shape of one's response, the insistence on acting from an interior freedom that the external situation cannot reach. He had been moving steadily through the commandments, tracing each one back to its interior origin or forward to its deepest demand. Now he arrived at the place the whole sequence had been building toward, the teaching that gathered up everything that preceded it and pressed it to its furthest point. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' The first half of this came directly from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. The second half, hate your enemy, does not appear in the Torah in those words, but it was an inference that various traditions had found plausible. If God's people were to be distinct from the nations, if Israel's enemies were in some sense the enemies of God's purposes, perhaps a measured hostility toward the outsider was not only permitted but appropriate. The boundary between neighbor and stranger, between those who fell within the range of one's love obligations and those who did not, had been a subject of active rabbinic debate, and the different answers drew the circle of obligation at different points. Even at the most generous readings, the circle had a boundary, and outside the boundary, if not hatred exactly, then at least the absence of the active love that was owed to those inside it. But I say to you, Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The verb agapao, the word translated as love, is the word that the Greek-speaking early church would come to use for the distinctive quality of love that characterized the divine character, not the love of eros, not the love of deep friendship and mutual delight, but the love that acts for the good of its object, regardless of whether the object has done anything to merit such treatment, regardless of whether the feeling accompanying the action is warm or cold, regardless of what the object has done in the past or is doing in the present. It is a love defined not by its emotional texture, but by its direction. It moves toward the person loved, for that person's benefit, whether or not anything in the situation recommends it. To love an enemy in this sense is to act for the good of the person who has acted against your good. To pray for those who persecute you is to bring before God, with whatever genuine care one can muster, the well-being of the people whose stated purpose is to harm you. This is not a psychological program for managing difficult feelings. It is a directive about behavior, rooted in a theological claim about the nature of God that Jesus made explicit in the sentence that followed. So that you may be children of your Father in heaven, he said, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. The theological grounding is everything here. The love of enemies is not recommended because it makes social conflicts more manageable, or because it makes the person practicing it feel more serene, or because it produces better outcomes in the long run. Though it may do all of these things, it is recommended because it corresponds to the fundamental character of the God in whose image human beings were created and to whom they are called to return. God's love, expressed in the most basic sustaining functions of the created order, does not follow a merit-based distribution. The sun does not withhold its warmth from the fields of people who have rejected God. The rain does not fall selectively on the crops of the devout and bypass the crops of the corrupt. Creation itself is an act of indiscriminate generosity, the daily renewal of a gift given to everyone who breathes without regard for what they have done with the breath they were given. This is the character of the Father. And to be children of the Father is to share that character, to extend that same indiscriminate generosity to those who have done nothing to deserve it, including and especially those who have done things that actively argued against it. He pressed the point with a rhetorical question that was not really a question at all. For if you love those who love you, he said, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? The tax collectors and the Gentiles were not being used as moral benchmarks against which the disciples needed to compete. They were being identified as the practitioners of the minimum, the lowest common denominator of human social behavior that any functional society manages to achieve. You help those who help you. You are kind to those who are kind to you. You extend warmth to your own people. Every human community on earth does this. The smallest village, the most isolated tribe, the most troubled family manages some version of reciprocal care among its members. Jesus said, "This is not distinctive. It does not mark you as participants in something different from the ordinary human world. It does not reflect anything particular about the character of the God you follow. It is merely the ordinary operation of ordinary social life. The disciples of the kingdom, the people the Beatitudes had described, the salt of the earth, the light of the world, these people were called to something that ordinary social life did not generate and could not sustain on its own resources." And then the sentence that closed the sixth antithesis, and with it the entire sequence. "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." The word teleos, perfect, is the adjective form of telos, which means the end, the goal, the purpose toward which something is aimed, and in terms of which its completion is defined. An arrow is teleos when it has reached the target. A plan is teleos when it has accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. A human being in this framework is teleos when they have arrived at the fullness of what they were created to be, when the image of God in which they were made has been fully expressed rather than distorted or suppressed or partially realized. The comparison is with the Father's perfection, and the context defines what that perfection consists of. The undiscriminating love that sustains the life of the undeserving, the generosity that extends to those who have done nothing to earn it, the refusal to limit the gift of sun and rain to those who have properly acknowledged the giver. To be perfect as the Father is perfect is to arrive at that same completeness of love, that same uncontracted generosity, the love that has no in-group and no out-group, that has no enemies, in the sense of people for whose well-being it does not act. 6 commandments, 6 extensions, 6 moments in which the law's external boundary had been traced back to the interior territory from which it arose, or forward to the destination toward which it had always been pointing: the anger behind murder, the desire behind adultery, the casual exercise of power hidden inside the certificate of divorce, the stratified speech concealed beneath the oath system, the interior freedom that turned the cheek and walked the second mile without becoming the aggressor's mirror, and the love that refused to stop at the boundary of the neighbor and found, beyond that boundary, the face of the enemy, for whom it was called to act as though they were the neighbor after all. The crowd on the hillside had heard the law all their lives. They had heard it expounded in the synagogues by scribes who cited their authorities and maintained the proper distance between the text and their own opinions. They had heard it enforced by the courts, and invoked in the markets, and referenced in the disputes between neighbors over property lines and water rights, and the 1,000 practical details that the law was supposed to govern. They had not heard it like this. They had not heard a man sit down on a hillside and trace each commandment back through the external behavior to the interior condition that generated it, and then tell them, in his own name, with no borrowed authority and no cited tradition, that the interior condition was what the commandment had always been about. The act was forbidden, yes, but the act arose from somewhere, and the law's deepest intention was to reach that somewhere, to address not just what a person did, but what a person was, to transform not just conduct, but character, to produce not managed compliance, but the kind of person who did not need to manage compliance, because the wanting itself had been changed. Be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. The sentence did not close the argument. It opened it, pressing into a future the crowd could barely see the shape of, gesturing toward a transformation that the sermon itself would continue to describe, turn by turn, teaching by teaching, demand by demand, as the man on the hillside showed no sign of being finished with what he had come to the hill to say. The 6 antitheses had done something to the crowd that mere instruction rarely does. They had shifted the location of the argument. Where the tradition had placed the boundary of the law at the edge of the external act, at murder and adultery and false oaths, Jesus had placed it somewhere much harder to see and much harder to manage, in the interior life, in the anger that preceded murder, in the gaze that preceded adultery, in the habitual untrustworthiness that made elaborate oath systems necessary in the first place. The commandments had always been an attempt to govern human behavior. Jesus had revealed that what the commandments were actually trying to govern was human character, the interior territory from which behavior arose. And you could manage behavior through external constraints, through courts and community pressure and social expectation. You could not manage character that way. Character was formed somewhere else, in somewhere that the courts could not reach and community pressure only rarely influenced. Now he turned to the practices that shaped that interior territory. The three central acts of Jewish religious devotion that defined the life of faithfulness in the first century, the practices that formed the person as surely as the commandments formed the community. Almsgiving, prayer, fasting. Every devout Jew on that hillside had grown up with all three. They were not optional additions to the religious life. They were its daily substance, its ordinary texture, the concrete practices through which the covenant relationship between God and the human person was maintained and renewed. Jesus was not introducing new disciplines. He was addressing the three disciplines that already existed and asking a question about them that cut to their root. For whom are you performing them? He opened with a framing statement that governed everything that followed. Beware, he said, of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. The word translated as beware carries the force of a serious warning, a genuine alertness to danger. Prosecute, pay attention, watch out, do not let this happen without noticing it. The danger he was naming was not external. It was internal and subtle, and capable of corrupting the most sincere-seeming acts of devotion without the person performing them necessarily being aware of the corruption. The key phrase is the one that specifies motive, in order to be seen by them. The Greek construction pros to theastheni autois is the infinitive of purpose. The action is performed for the sake of the watching. This is the same grammatical structure he had used when describing the man who looks at a woman in order to desire her. Both are cases where the grammar reveals that the corrupting element is not incidental to the act, but is its organizing principle, the reason the act is happening in the first place. A person who gives generously and happens to be seen giving is not the person Jesus is describing. A person who gives generously because being seen giving is exactly the person he is describing. The reward language requires some unpacking because it has been misread as a kind of cosmic bribery. Do your devotions privately, and God will pay you. The Greek word mistos means wages, the payment that is owed for work done, the settlement of an account. When Jesus says that those who perform their religion publicly for human approval have received their reward, the verb he uses, apekausin, is a technical term from the commercial documents of his day, the papyri and receipts that archaeologists have recovered from the ancient world, and it means precisely what the accounting context requires: paid in full. The account is settled. The transaction is complete. The person who gave alms in order to be seen has received exactly what they were seeking, which was the admiration of those who watched. The admiration came. The account with that particular act is closed. Nothing remains in it, nothing outstanding, nothing that the Father owes. The receipt has been issued. Conversely, the act performed in secret, unseen by any human audience, leaves an account open with the Father who sees in secret. The Father's seeing is contrasted with human seeing throughout this section, and the contrast is total, where human seeing requires visibility, public positioning, the staging of the act for maximum observation. The Father's seeing operates in precisely the place that human seeing cannot reach, in the hidden interior where the act is performed, and the motive that drives it is the only witness. The first of the three practices was the one most directly connected to the daily economic reality of the crowd on the hillside. Almsgiving, eleemosine, the giving of money or goods to those in need, was not simply a charitable option in first-century Jewish practice. It was a religious obligation, rooted in the law's repeated insistence that the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger had a claim on the generosity of those with more. The gleaning laws required landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that those without land could gather food. The sabbatical year laws required the cancellation of debts and the release of slaves. The tithes included a portion designated specifically for the poor. Almsgiving was the practical expression of the covenant community's commitment to its most vulnerable members. It was also, unavoidably, a practice that could be performed in ways that maximized the social credit of the giver. "Whenever you give alms," Jesus said, "do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others." The trumpet image has generated some debate about whether it describes a literal practice or is entirely figurative. Some scholars point to the trumpet-shaped collection vessels in the temple treasury, the 13 receptacles known as the shofars or trumpets, which produced a notable sound when coins were dropped into them, a sound that would have been louder and more attention-drawing when the coin was larger. Others take the trumpet as a pure metaphor for theatrical announcement. Whether the image is literal or figurative, its meaning is the same. The act of giving has been arranged for maximum public impact, the donor positioned where the most people will observe the gift and draw the appropriate conclusions about the donor's generosity and piety. These are the hypocrites, and the word bears repeating in its original register. A hypokrites, in the theatrical tradition of classical Greece, was an actor, a performer, someone who played a role before an audience. The theatrical context was not morally loaded. Actors did their job. Jesus borrows the word and fills it with a new content. The religious hypocrite is the person whose piety is a performance, whose visible devotion is a role played before an audience of human witnesses, whose interior reality may or may not correspond to the exterior display. The mask is the issue. The performance for a human audience, conducted within what is supposed to be an act directed toward God, has replaced the act itself with its own mirror image. "But when you give alms," he said, "do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." The image of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing is, of course, a physical impossibility. The hands belong to the same body, the body to the same person, and the person will always be aware at some level of their own actions. The hyperbole is the point. Jesus is pressing toward a condition of giving so thoroughly free of self-consciousness, so completely unconcerned with its own visibility, even to the internal audience of the self, that the act of giving is done and released without pausing to register its own virtue. The giver gives, and the gift leaves, and no internal account is opened in which the giver's sense of their own generosity accumulates. The Father who sees in secret is not a spy operating in the private spaces of human life. He is the one whose seeing is not contingent on the external staging that human seeing requires. Human eyes need light, proximity, the correct angle of observation. The Father needs none of these. The interior act, performed in the absence of any human audience, is as fully visible to him as any public declaration performed at maximum volume in the most crowded space in Jerusalem. And it is the interior act, precisely because it has not been paid for by human approval, that leaves the account with the Father open. He turned from giving to prayer, and the shape of the teaching was the same, but the content was richer, because prayer was not simply a practice but a relationship. And the perversions of prayer he was about to describe were perversions not just of a religious exercise, but of the relationship the exercise was meant to sustain. "When you pray," he said, Do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. The word love is pointed. These people do not merely pray in visible places out of habit or convenience. They love it. The visibility is the attraction. Standing was the ordinary posture for Jewish prayer. So it is not the posture, but the positioning that Jesus is addressing. The synagogue, where the community was gathered, and the pious man's prayer would be observed by everyone present, and the street corners, where the intersection of multiple paths ensured the maximum possible passing audience. The hypocrite has done the work of site selection, has considered the options and chosen the locations that optimize for observation. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. The room, timeion in Greek, was the inner room of the house, often the storeroom, the most private space available in a small Galilean dwelling. It was where one kept things, rather than where one received guests or conducted the social transactions of daily life. To go into the inner room and shut the door was to remove oneself entirely from the social world, to enter a space where the only relationship present was the one being addressed. The shut door is not merely a practical measure against interruption. It is a statement about the nature of the conversation. This is not a performance for an audience. This is a conversation between two parties, one of whom sees in secret. And then he turned to a second distortion of prayer, different in kind from the hypocrite's public performance, but rooted in the same fundamental misunderstanding of what prayer was. When you pray, he said, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. The Gentile religious practices that surrounded the world of first-century Judaism were varied and complex, but a recognizable feature of many of them was the extended invocation, the accumulation of divine names and epithets and appeals, the repetitive multiplication of words as a mechanism for securing divine attention. The assumption embedded in such practices was that the deity needed to be persuaded, that persistence and volume would wear down divine indifference or overcome divine distance, that the gods required a certain quantity of human supplication before they were sufficiently moved to respond. Do not be like them, Jesus said, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This sentence does not make prayer redundant. It makes it honest. If the Father already knows what is needed, the prayer cannot be an act of information transfer, a communication of urgent facts to a God who would otherwise be unaware of them. Prayer is not the mechanism by which God is informed of human need. The God being addressed already knows. The prayer is therefore something else. It is the act of turning, of orienting the self toward the Father in acknowledged dependence, of aligning one's own awareness with the awareness that God already holds, of entering a relationship honestly, rather than maintaining the pretense that the one praying has no needs and requires nothing from outside themselves. To pray is to acknowledge, before you say anything else, that you are not self-sufficient. This acknowledgement, this posture of genuine dependence, is itself the beginning of what the Father is seeking from the conversation. And then he gave them a model. Pray then like this, he said. The Greek hutos, meaning in this manner or in this way, functions as a template rather than a script. This is the shape that authentic prayer takes, the model of the relationship it expresses and the petitions it makes. What followed was not a magic formula to be recited, but a map of the interior territory that prayer was supposed to explore. Our Father in heaven. The opening address is the whole sermon's theological center expressed in 4 words. Our Father, not my Father, not the Father of the particularly devout, not the Father of Israel alone in contrast to the nations. Our Father. The prayer begins in community. In the first person, plural, in a solidarity that encompasses everyone who prays it, alongside every other person who prays it. Even in the shut inner room, Behind the closed door, the person praying does not approach the Father as a solitary individual with solitary needs. They approach as one member of a family that includes everyone else who has ever stood before this Father in genuine need. In heaven, not a spatial location, not a point on a map somewhere above the clouds. The heavens in the Jewish tradition expressed a mode of existence and a quality of being rather than a direction. God in the heavens was the God who was not confined to any earthly location, not identified with any particular hill or temple or nation, not reducible to any specific site of worship or system of access. The one in the heavens was the one who was beyond all the particular places where human beings tried to locate the divine, the one who contained the earthly rather than being contained by it. The warmth of Father in the context of the one in the heavens was itself a theological statement. The transcendent one was also, in the teaching of Jesus, the intimate one, not distant in his transcendence, not cold in his universality. The word Jesus used in his own Aramaic speech, the word that underlies the Greek pater, was Abba. The word a child used for their father in the ordinary domestic conversation of a family, warm and direct and unguarded in a way that the more formal modes of divine address in the tradition were not. To open prayer with this word was to make a claim about the nature of the relationship, not petitioner approaching deity through elaborate ritual protocols, but child speaking to Father with the directness that genuine relationship permits. Hallowed be your name. The petition is in the passive imperative. Not I will hallow your name. Not may I honor your name in my behavior, but let your name be hallowed by whatever is needed to make it so. In the Hebrew tradition, the name of God was not simply a label by which to refer to him. The name was the self-disclosure, the revelation of character, the way God had made himself knowable to those he had addressed. I am who I am, the God of Abraham, the God who brings out his people from Egypt with a mighty hand. To know the name was to know something true about the nature of the one who bore it. To hallow the name was to treat that revealed nature with the seriousness and reverence it deserved, to refuse to reduce it, to live and speak in ways that made it visible and credible in the world. The prophet Ezekiel had spoken of the name being profaned. Israel's behavior among the nations had led those nations to draw conclusions about the character of Israel's God that dishonored him, had made it look as though the God of the covenant was either indifferent to his people's condition or unable to help them. God had spoken of restoring Israel for the sake of his holy name, so that the nations would know who he was through the evidence of what he did. The petition, hallowed be your name, placed the one praying inside that same history. It was a request for the world to come to know and rightly treat the God who was being addressed, for the divine character to be made visible through events and people and circumstances that demonstrated it clearly, for the name that had been obscured to be revealed. And this had personal implications that the crowd would not have missed. If you pray that God's name be hallowed, you are praying that God be made known through the world, and you are one of the surfaces of the world through which he is made known or obscured. The petition is simultaneously a prayer for the world and a commitment about one's own life. Let your name be hallowed includes, let it be hallowed through me. Your kingdom come. This petition carried the full weight of everything the crowd on the hillside had been longing for, and the full complexity of what they had been expecting. The kingdom of God was not a territory. The Greek basileia pointed primarily to the reign itself, the active exercise of royal authority, the sovereign governance of God becoming actual in the world, rather than remaining a theological assertion about who ultimately holds power. The crowd had been praying for the kingdom in various forms their entire lives. In the synagogue prayers, in the Passover liturgy with its memory of liberation and its hope for a greater liberation, in the private prayers they offered during whatever work consumed their days, they knew what they meant by it, or they thought they did. Jesus had already begun to complicate their understanding of what the kingdom's arrival looked like. The Beatitudes had described kingdom people who did not look like people exercising royal authority. The antitheses had described kingdom behavior that did not resemble the behavior of any conquering force. And now this petition asked for the kingdom to come, for the divine reign to become fully real in the world, for the sovereignty of God to be exercised in a way that was complete rather than partial. The next phrase in Matthew's version functions as the kingdom petition's own explanation. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The coming of the kingdom is the doing of God's will in the earthly realm, and the measure of its completeness is the heaven standard, the place where the divine will meets no resistance, no counter-will, no competing agenda. Heaven is not a place of forced compliance, but of perfect alignment, where the will of God and the reality of what exists correspond without friction or remainder. Earth is the place where that alignment is perpetually contested, where the human will and the divine will are constantly in the process of negotiation or conflict. The petition is for the gap between earth and heaven to close, for what is true in heaven to become, through whatever means the Father chooses, true here. Give us this day our daily bread. The petition is simple on its surface and inexhaustible underneath. The word translated as daily, epiousion, is among the rarest words in the Greek of the New Testament, and, as far as the surviving record shows, nowhere else in ancient Greek literature. Its etymology has been debated since the early Church. The most plausible reading connects it to the idea of the bread for the coming day, or bread for the day, that is, the sufficient bread of today. Some early interpreters read it as pointing toward a higher register, a supersubstantial or spiritual bread, and the liturgical use of the Lord's Prayer in Eucharistic contexts gave this reading a long life in Christian tradition. The primary reading, however, is material, the bread that is needed for today. The petition is precisely bounded. Not give us our bread for the year, not grant us the accumulation that will make tomorrow's prayer unnecessary, not provide us with the security that would allow us to stop asking. Give us today what today requires. The parallel in the minds of the Galilean crowd would have been immediate. The manna in the wilderness, the bread that appeared each morning for the Israelites during their 40 years of wandering, fresh and sufficient for the day's need, without the possibility of stockpiling against future uncertainty. Those who tried to keep overnight what they had gathered found it rotted. The provision was daily, and the dependence was daily, and that was the point. The wilderness generation was being formed into a people who trusted the one who provided, rather than trusting their own stored reserves. To pray for daily bread in this sense was to adopt formally and deliberately the posture of daily dependence. It was to begin each day by acknowledging that the sufficiency of today was not earned, not guaranteed by yesterday's labor, not secured against tomorrow's contingencies, but given, received. And in the world of first-century Galilee, where most of the people on that hillside could not be entirely certain of tomorrow's bread in any concrete sense, the petition was not a spiritual metaphor requiring translation into practical terms. It was the most practical request one could make, offered to the one who the prayer had already established as both powerful enough to provide it and close enough to care whether it arrived. And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. The word Matthew uses for the offenses requiring forgiveness is ophelemata, debts. Luke's parallel uses the language of sins directly. Matthew's debt language is not careless or interchangeable with the other. It places the petition in a specific material and relational framework that the crowd knew from the inside of daily life. Debt in first-century Galilee was not an abstract financial concept. It was the concrete structure within which many lives were organized. The debt to the tax collector that was always present and always pressing. The debt to the neighbor who had lent grain after a bad harvest, and whose patience had its limits. The debt to the landlord, whose interest rates made the principal recede like a horizon, the faster you walked toward it. When the law spoke of the year of Jubilee, when debts were canceled and land returned to its original owners, it was addressing not a theoretical category, but the actual weight of actual obligations that actual people in actual difficulty could not lift off themselves. When Jesus elsewhere would tell parables in which a king canceled a vast debt, or in which a dishonest steward reduced the debts of his master's debtors to secure his own future, the audience knew precisely what the word debt meant and what it felt like to carry one. To ask forgiveness of one's debts to God, the offenses and failures and broken obligations that one had accumulated in relation to the covenant, was to use the most immediately comprehensible vocabulary of obligation and release. And the "as" is the most demanding word in the petition. Forgive us as we have forgiven. The grammar places the human act of forgiveness temporally before the petition for divine forgiveness. The "as" refers to something already done, not something being promised. Forgive us, as we have already forgiven those who owe us. The petition assumes that the person praying has dealt with their own debtors before making the request. Jesus returned to this single petition alone, of all the elements in the prayer, immediately after its conclusion, as the one thing he wanted to ensure had not slipped past without full attention. If you forgive others their trespasses, he said, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. The reciprocal is not punitive in a mechanical sense. God is not withholding forgiveness as a punishment for unforgiveness, waiting with arms crossed until the human has performed the required action. The logic is deeper than that. The person who has genuinely received forgiveness, who has been changed by the experience of an unpayable debt being canceled, finds that the experience creates a new disposition toward the debts of others. The change is not merely ethical, not merely the application of a principle of fairness. It is the overflow of something that was received. The person who remains closed to forgiving others, who has received forgiveness in the formal sense while remaining fundamentally unchanged by it, may not yet have received it in the sense that matters, at the depth where the receiving actually transforms. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. This petition has troubled attentive readers since the early church, because it seemed to imply that God might otherwise lead people into temptation, and the letter of James was explicit that God tempts no one. The resolution lies in understanding the word perismos, which covers both temptation in the internal sense, the pressure from within toward moral failure, and trial in the external sense, the ordeal that tests faith from outside. In the experience of first-century believers, particularly those who faced persecution for their allegiance to Jesus, the two were often the same event viewed from different angles. The external pressure of persecution was simultaneously the internal temptation to recant, to find a way to make the pressure stop by abandoning the position that had attracted it. The petition is not a theological assertion about God's role in the distribution of temptation. It is a prayer from a person who knows their own fragility, who has no illusions about their capacity to navigate every crisis successfully on their own resources. Do not bring us to the place where the testing exceeds what we can bear. It is the prayer of honest self-knowledge. The acknowledgement that the praying person is not a finished saint capable of enduring any ordeal with perfect faith, but a person in process, vulnerable to exactly the kinds of failures that the antitheses had been naming, capable of the anger behind murder and the gaze behind adultery and all the rest, in need of the Father's protective management of what comes their way. And deliver us from the evil one, rusai hemas apo tu poneru. The word poneros is ambiguous in a way that the Greek seems to allow deliberately. It can be read as the abstract evil, the force of opposition to the divine order, or as the evil one, the personal agency of that opposition. Jesus had already used the phrase from the evil one when speaking of the oath system. Anything more than yes and no comes from the evil one. The personal reading has some warrant in the sermon's own usage. But the ambiguity may not require resolution. The evil one and the evil are not separable in any way that makes the distinction practically significant for the person praying. The petition is for rescue, for the kind of deliverance that does not depend on the praying person's own strength, for the Father's active intervention in the face of what the praying person cannot overcome alone. He moved from prayer to the third practice, and the structure was the same as the first two. Whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. The word aphanazousin, disfigure, literally means to make invisible or to make disappear. The face is made to vanish behind an exaggerated display of deprivation. The signs of fasting in the first-century Jewish tradition included the unwashed face, the disheveled or ash-covered hair, the drawn and hollow expression of sustained privation. These were the conventional markers of mourning and penitence, and they were recognizable to anyone who saw them. The person who walked through the streets of a Galilean town displaying these signs was broadcasting their fast as surely as a public announcement, and the message was the same as the trumpet before the alms. Look at my devotion. Recognize my piety. Assign me the social credit that this costs. But when you fast, Jesus said, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. The instruction was precisely the opposite of the hypocrite's practice. Not just the absence of the dramatic display, but the positive adoption of the normal, everyday appearance of a person who is not fasting. Oil on the head was a sign of festivity in the Hebrew tradition, of celebration rather than mourning. The guest who came to a feast arrived with oiled hair and washed face, the marks of occasion and abundance. Jesus was telling the person who was fasting to look to all outward appearance, as though they were feasting. The fast was to be invisible to every observer, contained entirely within the relationship between the person and the Father, with no external leak, no visible trace, no social dividend. The three practices, considered together, form a single teaching with a single shape. Each of the three is a central act of Jewish devotion. Each of the three can be corrupted by the same fundamental error, the redirection of an act intended for God toward the human audience that surrounds it. And each of the three, practiced in the freedom from human observation, opens a different kind of account, not with the crowd whose approval was sought, but with the Father whose seeing operates precisely where human seeing cannot reach. The insight that ran through all three was more than a rule about religious behavior. It was a description of a fundamental division in the human soul between the self that performs and the self that actually is, between the public face of devotion and the private reality of what one actually wants and actually does when no one is watching. Jesus was not saying that public worship was wrong or that religious community was a snare. He was saying that the interior life, the life conducted in the place where only God sees, was the life that actually mattered, the life from which the exterior eventually arose, the territory where character was actually formed rather than merely displayed. The crowd on the hillside had been given, in these few hundred words, a model of prayer that was simultaneously the simplest and the most demanding thing they had ever heard. Simple in its language, rooted in the most basic human needs and the most fundamental human relationships. Demanding in its implications, because to pray it honestly, to mean its every word, required a posture of total dependence and a depth of forgiveness that the sermon had already shown to be far beyond ordinary human capacity to sustain. The God addressed was close enough to be called Father and infinite enough to dwell in the heavens. The kingdom prayed for was already arriving and not yet complete. The bread asked for was enough for today, and tomorrow's provision was not yet in hand. The forgiveness sought was conditional on a forgiveness already extended that might require everything the person praying had already spent in the antitheses, trying to understand. The man on the hillside had given them the shape of the relationship and the shape of the prayer that expressed it. Now he turned from how they were to pray to how they were to hold everything that was not prayer. The material world, the things they owned and the things they wanted to own, the anxiety that arrived with every morning's uncertainty about whether the provision they had asked for would actually come. The transition was not a change of subject. It was an extension of the same subject into a different territory. The Lord's Prayer had asked for daily bread, had asked for the provision of today without accumulating the provision of tomorrow, had asked for the posture of daily dependence before a Father who already knew what was needed. What followed now was the full development of that posture, what it meant for a person's relationship to material things, what it demanded of the interior life, what it had to say about the worry that settled over a person like weather, when the harvest was uncertain, or the tax collector was coming, or the clothing was wearing thin, and there was nothing in reserve to replace it. The crowd on that hillside lived with a relationship to material things that most people who have read this passage across the centuries have not shared. Subsistence was not a dramatic emergency for most of them. It was the ordinary condition of ordinary life, the permanent background hum against which every other aspect of existence was conducted. To worry about tomorrow's food was not neurosis or a failure of spiritual imagination. It was the rational response to a world in which tomorrow's food was genuinely uncertain for a significant portion of the people sitting in the grass. When Jesus began to address anxiety, he was not addressing a psychological tendency in need of management. He was addressing a theological condition in need of diagnosis. He began with treasure, because treasure was where the anxiety had its root. "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth," he said, "where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." The three vulnerabilities he named were not chosen at random. They were the specific forms of decay that attacked the specific forms of wealth available to people in the world of first-century Galilee. Wealth in the ancient Mediterranean world was not typically held as currency in a bank. It was held in goods, in fabric, in stored grain, in metal objects and ornaments and coins. The rich man of the tradition stored his harvest in barns. His wife's jewelry was an investment in portable wealth. His embroidered robes were a statement of prosperity that had a real material value beyond their decorative function. Moth attacked the fabric. The Greek word translated as rust, brosis, literally means a gnawing or an eating away. It covers not only the oxidation of metal, but the general consumption of stored goods by decay, by rodents, by the slow entropy that worked on everything held in storage. Thieves completed the picture. Even what had survived the moth and the rust could be taken. Thieves break in, and the word for break in, diorizo, means literally to dig through. In a world where houses were built of mud, brick, and plaster, a determined thief could bypass the door entirely by digging through the wall. The specificity of the vulnerabilities was itself a teaching. Jesus was not making a general philosophical point about the impermanence of earthly things. He was identifying the actual mechanisms by which the actual wealth of actual people in his audience was subject to actual loss. The man sitting on the hillside, who had worked all his life to accumulate a modest store of goods, knew about moths and knew about rust and knew about thieves, had probably experienced one or all three of them. Jesus was not asking him to imagine a hypothetical. He was asking him to look clearly at something he already knew. "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal." The treasures in heaven were not a different investment strategy, with superior long-term returns. The metaphor of the heavenly treasury in the Jewish tradition pointed to acts of generosity, justice, and faithfulness performed in the earthly world that were, in the accounting of the divine economy, preserved beyond the reach of all three of the earthly vulnerabilities. the alms given in secret that the Father saw in secret, the mercy extended to those who could not repay it, the righteousness pursued even at cost to one's own material position. These accumulated in an economy that moths could not enter, and rust could not reach, and no one could dig through the wall to steal. And then the sentence that turned the passage from practical advice about wealth management into something considerably more searching. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The direction of this sentence is not the direction one might expect. One might expect, where your heart is, there you will put your treasure, as a description of how existing commitments produce corresponding investments. Jesus reversed it. The treasure determines the heart's location, what you store, what you protect, what you organize your precautions around, becomes the destination of your deepest attention, the home address of your most persistent loyalty. The investment creates the attachment. The attachment defines the self. And the self that has been defined by the defense of earthly treasure has placed its heart in the one location where the moth, the rust, and the thief have guaranteed access. This was not a teaching against the possession of material things. It was a teaching about what happens when material things assume the organizing role in a person's life, when they become the thing around which everything else is arranged, when protecting them becomes the central anxiety that shapes the day. The person whose treasure was on earth would find their heart on earth, attending to the earthly vulnerabilities, measuring every decision against the earthly balance sheet. The person whose treasure was in heaven would find their heart there, attending to something that no earthly weather system could reach. He moved from treasure to the eye, and the connection was not immediately obvious to the crowd, but it became clear as he developed it. The eye is the lamp of the body, he said. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. The Greek word translated as healthy is hapless, and it does not quite mean healthy in the medical sense. It means single, undivided, uncompounded, not attempting to be two things simultaneously. The single eye is the eye that is pointed in one direction, that is not trying to maintain focus on two incompatible destinations at once. The word translated as bad is poneros, the same word used for the evil one in the Lord's Prayer, and in the Hebrew tradition behind the Greek. The concept of the evil eye was a recognized idiom for covetousness, for the acquisitive orientation toward the world that turned everything it saw into a potential possession. The ayin tova, the good eye, was the Hebrew idiom for generosity. The person of good eye was the open-handed person who gave freely. The evil eye grasped. The lamp metaphor was the key. The eye was understood in the ancient world to be the organ by which light entered the body, the mechanism through which the inner person received illumination from the external world. If the eye was functioning rightly, the whole body was lit. If the eye was compromised, the whole body was in darkness. Applied to the question of treasure and heart, the teaching said this: the orientation of the eye, the direction in which it was looking, and what it was seeking, determined whether the whole interior life was illuminated or obscured. The person whose eye was pointed toward earthly treasure was a person whose entire inner world was organized around the defense and accumulation of that treasure, and the apparent light of that organization was not light at all. It was the darkness of a person who had mistaken their organizing anxiety for their illuminating purpose. If then the light in you is darkness, he said, how great is the darkness? The paradox was pointed and uncomfortable. The person in this condition was not obviously in darkness. They experienced themselves as having a clear purpose, a coherent set of priorities, a rational organization of their concerns. They were, in their own interior experience, people who could see. The horror of the bad eye in Jesus' description was precisely that the darkness it produced was invisible from inside it. The person whose single-minded pursuit of earthly treasure had filled them with darkness had mistaken the darkness for light and organized an entire life around the management of something that was not illuminating them at all. "No one can serve two masters," he said, "for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." The word translated as money is mammonas, mammon, an Aramaic word that does not translate cleanly into any single English equivalent. It pointed to wealth, but wealth understood as a power with a claim on the person rather than merely a tool in the person's hands. Mammon was not coins or barns or fabric stores considered neutrally as resources available for use. Mammon was what those things became when they began to function as a master, when the accumulation and protection of material wealth became the organizing principle of a life, the thing to which other things were subordinated, the loyalty that took priority when other loyalties conflicted with it. The word serve, douloer, was the vocabulary of slavery, not employment. An employee contracted with an employer for specific hours and specific tasks and retained a self outside the employment relationship. A slave belonged to the master entirely. Time, labor, loyalty, the body's availability, the whole person. The slave's service was not divisible between two masters, because there was no self left outside the service to do the dividing. Two masters would mean two complete claims on a person who could only be completely possessed by one. The attempt to serve both would satisfy neither, and the slave in the middle would be destroyed by the impossibility of the position. Jesus was not saying that wealthy people could not follow him, or that the possession of material resources was inherently corrupting. The teaching on treasure had been about where the heart went, not about the mere existence of stored goods. But the teaching on two masters was about what happened when material wealth assumed the structural role of a master, when it became the thing one's ultimate loyalty was organized around, when the defense of it took precedence over the claims of God on one's time, labor, and allegiance. At that point, it was not wealth anymore. It was a competing deity, and you cannot worship two deities any more than a slave can be wholly owned by two masters. The juxtaposition of God and mammon was therefore not a warning against greed in the ordinary sense of wanting more than one had. It was a structural observation about the impossibility of two ultimate loyalties. The loyalty that organized everything around the accumulation and protection of material wealth, and the loyalty that organized everything around the kingdom and the righteousness of God. One of them was going to be first. The attempt to keep both genuinely first was the evil eye that had mistaken its darkness for light. Therefore, he said, and the therefore was doing real work. Everything that followed was the consequence of the teaching about treasure and masters, the practical corollary of having one master and one loyalty, and one ultimate organizing concern. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? The Greek word for anxious, merimnao, carries in its root the sense of being pulled in two directions. The mind divided against itself, split between what is and what might be, between the present moment and the imagined future in which the present moment has gone wrong. Anxiety is, etymologically and experientially, the condition of the divided mind, and the divided mind was precisely what the teaching on two masters had been describing. The person serving mammon was the person whose mind was divided between what they had and what they feared losing it, between the present sufficiency and the imagined future insufficiency, between the provision that had arrived and the provision that might not. The word appears 6 times in this short passage, repeated with the persistence of a teacher who wants to make absolutely certain the point has registered. Do not be anxious. Which of you by being anxious, do not be anxious, saying, Do not be anxious about tomorrow. The repetition is itself a measure of how deeply embedded the anxiety was in the lives of the people on the hillside, how thoroughly it had organized their interior lives, how much of their daily mental energy it was consuming. Jesus was not dismissing it with a pleasant instruction to cheer up. He was engaging it as the serious theological condition it was, the condition of people who had not yet fully trusted the Father whose provision they had just learned to request each morning. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? The question was not rhetorical in the dismissive sense. It was rhetorical in the sense that the answer was obvious, and the obviousness of the answer was the problem. Everyone on that hillside would have said immediately, yes, obviously life is more than food. And then they would have gone home and organized the next day around the question of food, because the anxiety did not respond to the abstract acknowledgement of the answer. It required something more than the correct opinion. It required a reorientation of the whole person toward the Father who provided, the kind of reorientation that the Lord's Prayer had been describing and the kind that the teaching on treasure had been preparing for. The question is designed not to be answered and filed away, but to interrupt the organizing assumption of the anxious life and hold it up to examination long enough for the absurdity to become visible. Look at the birds of the air, he said. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Luke's version of this teaching specified ravens, and the choice of the raven, if that is what lay behind the broader birds of the air in Matthew, was deliberately pointed. The raven was among the ritually unclean birds in the Levitical taxonomy. It did not make the cut for the clean category, was not available as food, occupied the lower reaches of the Jewish estimation of the natural order. And yet, the Heavenly Father feeds it. The divine care extended not to the clean and approved and ritually acceptable birds alone, not to the birds that one might mention in polite religious company, but to the marginal bird, the unclean bird, the bird that the tradition had placed outside the boundary of what was acceptable. God fed that bird. The form of the argument was the rabbinic kal vahomer, the lighter to heavier reasoning that moved from a lesser case to a greater one. If the conclusion was true in the smaller case, how much more certainly was it true in the larger one? If God fed the raven, how much more certainly would he provide for the people he had made in his image, called his children, taught to address him as Father, established a covenant with, across the entire history of Israel. The ravens were not children of the Father. They did not pray. They did not seek the kingdom or hunger for righteousness, or make peace or bear persecution for righteousness' sake, and the Father fed them. The disciples, who were all of those things, or were being formed into them, had a claim on the Father's provision that the unclean bird did not share. The argument from lesser to greater was not a guarantee of comfort or wealth. It was a logical demonstration that the anxiety made no theological sense. And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? The Greek word helikia can mean either span of life or physical stature, and the word paches, which follows it, can mean either a unit of time or the cubit that measured height. The translation has oscillated between the two readings since the earliest commentators. Both work. Whether the anxious person is trying to extend their lifespan or their physical height by worrying about it, the result is the same: nothing. Not a single unit of the desired thing is added by the worry. The anxiety is not merely spiritually problematic. It is practically useless, failing on its own terms, not producing even a small quantity of the thing it is organized around producing. The person who worries about dying has not, in the history of human experience, added a single day to their life by worrying about it. The person who worries about their height has never grown a cubit from the anxiety. The worry accomplishes precisely nothing toward the outcomes it is worrying about, which makes it, in addition to being theologically disordered, simply irrational. And why are you anxious about clothing? he continued, pressing into the second of the two material anxieties he had named. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. The word consider, katamaphet, means to learn by looking carefully, to attend to something with the full weight of observational attention. Not a glance, not a passing notice, but the kind of looking that actually takes in what is there. He was asking them to look at something they had been walking past for their entire lives, to actually see the wildflowers that grew in the rocky fields of Galilee, the flowers that arrived with the spring rains and were gone before summer, that pushed through limestone and thin soil without irrigation or cultivation or the labor of human hands. The lilies of the field in first-century Galilee were most likely the wild flowers of the Palestinian spring, the scarlet anemone, the crown anemone, the cyclamen, the iris, the spring flowers that turned the hillsides to color for a few weeks and then were gone. They did not toil. They did not do the agricultural labor of the men in the crowd, the plowing and sowing and irrigation and harvesting that organized the working year. They did not spin. They did not do the domestic labor of the women in the crowd, the spinning and weaving and dyeing that turned raw fiber into the clothing that bodies required. They simply grew in the way that living things grow when the conditions are right, without strategy or anxiety or the defensive management of their own existence. Yet I tell you, he said, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Solomon was the measure of earthly magnificence in the Jewish tradition, the king whose wealth was so extraordinary that it had become legendary, whose court and whose temple had drawn visitors from the ends of the known world to see with their own eyes whether the reports were accurate. The clothes of Solomon's court were the product of the finest artisans working with the most expensive materials available, silk and linen and wool, dyed with the purple that required thousands of sea snails to produce a single garment's worth of color, embroidered with gold thread, assembled by skilled craftspeople, whose entire labor was directed toward making royalty look as magnificent as royalty was supposed to look. And the spring wildflower of a Galilean hillside was clothed more magnificently, not more expensively, not with more human craft or more costly materials, more magnificently, in the sense that the beauty of the flower was a beauty that had not been assembled by anxiety and calculation and the deployment of resources, but had simply arrived, the way all genuinely beautiful things arrive, not managed, but given. Solomon's craftspeople had been trying to approximate what the flower did without trying. The approximation, however skilled, was still an approximation. The crowd that heard this was not a crowd of wealthy people who needed a lesson in the limitations of luxury. Most of them were wearing the ordinary clothing of ordinary Galilean people, undyed linen, wool, the practical garments of people who worked outdoors and needed durability more than elegance. The comparison between Solomon's splendor and a wildflower was not addressed to people who had to be talked out of their wardrobes. It was addressed to people who worried about whether they would have clothes at all, people for whom the question of clothing was not aesthetic, but existential. And to them he said, look at what God has done for the thing that exists for a season and then burns. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? The grass and the wildflowers, dried in the Palestinian summer and were used as fuel, gathered and burned in the stone ovens that heated the bread. The beautiful thing was also the transient thing, the thing with the shortest possible tenure in the world, existing for a season before becoming combustion. It was clothed by God with a beauty that surpassed the greatest human craft in history. And the people on the hillside, who were not transient wildflowers destined for the oven, but human beings made in the image of God, called children of the Father, formed into a community of the kingdom, given a prayer that began with the address to a Father in heaven, how much more certainly would they be provided for? Oligopistoi, the little faith ones. The word was not an accusation of unbelief, It was a diagnosis of faith that was genuine but small, present but undeveloped, real enough to have brought these people up the hillside to hear this teacher, but not yet large enough to trust the Father for tomorrow's provisions. The disciples were not condemned for their anxiety. They were described accurately. People who believed enough to be here, not yet enough to stop worrying about the clothes. The word was gentle in the way that accurate diagnoses are sometimes gentle. It named the condition without cruelty, and in the naming left open the possibility of growth. Therefore, do not be anxious, he said again, the fourth use of the word in this short passage, as though the repetition itself was a form of practice. The word spoken often enough to begin to loosen the grip of the condition it named. Do not be anxious, saying, "What shall we eat?" Or "What shall we drink?" Or "What shall we wear?" For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. The Gentiles appear in this passage in the same role they played when Jesus pointed out that even they love those who love them back and greet their own people with warmth. They represent the baseline of ordinary human behavior in the absence of the particular knowledge that the covenant had provided. The Gentiles sought food and drink and clothing first, because there was, in their framework, no alternative. They did not have the Father who provided daily bread to a people who had been sustained in a wilderness for 40 years. They did not have the covenant history of a God who had consistently, even when his people had not deserved it, maintained the provision necessary for their survival. Their anxiety about material necessities was rational, because within their framework there was no other ground for confidence about the provision. The disciples had a different framework. They had the Father, who already knew what they needed, established not as a theological abstraction, but as the first address of the prayer they had just been taught. The knowing of the Father preceded the asking. The request for daily bread was not an information transfer, was not the communication of needs that the Father would not otherwise have known. The Father knew. The prayer was the posture of acknowledged dependence on a provision that was already understood and already being managed. To be anxious about what the Gentiles sought was to operate as though one had no Father, as though the knowledge and the care and the provision of the Father were not already in play, as though one were alone in the world with nothing between oneself and the three vulnerabilities of moth, rust, and thief. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. The word first, proton, was doing precise work. Not seek the kingdom instead of food and drink and clothing, as though those things did not matter, or as though the disciples were above needing them. Seek them first, as the organizing principle, the primary loyalty, the telos toward which the life was pointed. The one who sought the kingdom first was not the one who had transcended material needs or achieved a spiritually elevated indifference to physical existence. It was the one who had gotten the priority right, who had placed the kingdom and the righteousness of the kingdom at the center of their concern and organized everything else around that center, including the daily petition for bread and the daily trust that the petition would be heard. All these things will be added: the food, the drink, the clothing, the material provisions that the Gentiles sought first. They were not eliminated from the picture. They were relocated in it. The person who sought the kingdom first was not the person who starved for righteousness while neglecting to eat. They were the person for whom the provision of material necessities was held within a larger trust, was received as a gift rather than seized in anxiety, was grateful for rather than defended against every conceivable threat. The verb added, prostathesetai, is in the divine passive. God will add them. The same structure as they shall be comforted in the Beatitudes, the same deliberate avoidance of naming the divine actor while making it unmistakably clear who the actor is. The one who seeks the kingdom first will find the material provisions added by the one who already knows they are needed, who clothes the wild flowers of a Galilean spring more magnificently than Solomon's entire wardrobe, who feeds the ravens and the birds of the air and has made an explicit claim to care far more for the people on this hillside than for any of those. Therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, he said, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. The fifth use of the word anxious in this passage, and this time it had a slightly different texture. A note of wry observation about the futility of the practice, that the formal theological arguments had not quite contained. Tomorrow will be anxious for itself. The sentence had the quality of a man who had noticed something true about the structure of worry and found it, in addition to being theologically disordered, almost comically counterproductive. Tomorrow's troubles were going to arrive on their own schedule, regardless of how much of today was spent anticipating them. The person who worried about tomorrow had not thereby reduced tomorrow's troubles. They had simply added today's anxiety to tomorrow's actual difficulties, doubling the burden without changing the outcome. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. The word translated as trouble, kakia, more typically means wickedness or badness. The badness of today is sufficient for today. The formulation had a pragmatic bluntness that all the theological argument had been building toward. You have enough to deal with in the present moment. The present moment has its actual difficulties, and its actual demands, and its actual claim on your attention and your faith. The future has its own difficulties and its own demands, and they will arrive when they arrive and will require whatever response they require. The person who has sought the kingdom first today, who has trusted the Father for today's provision today, will face tomorrow's difficulties with whatever faith today's trust has built in them. The person who has spent today worrying about tomorrow will face tomorrow's difficulties with the added exhaustion of today's anxiety, having gained nothing from the anticipation except the wearing down of the very resources needed to respond. The crowd on the hillside had heard, in the space of a few hundred words, the most comprehensive account of the relationship between the human person and the material world that any of them had encountered. The Beatitudes had described the poor in spirit and those who hungered for righteousness as blessed. Now the teaching on treasure and anxiety had explained what that poverty of spirit and that hunger looked like in practice, in the daily management of the question of material provision. The Lord's Prayer had asked for daily bread. Now the teaching on anxiety had explained what the posture of that asking required in the hours between prayers, in the face of the uncertainty that did not resolve simply because the request had been made. He had not told them to be indifferent to physical need. He had not told them that suffering did not matter, or that the difficulties of subsistence were merely apparent. He had told them that the anxiety about those difficulties, the organizing of the interior life around the defense against them, the placing of mammon in the structural role of master, these were the conditions that blocked the kingdom's work in them, that divided the eye that needed to be single, that filled the body with darkness while giving it the experience of light. And the alternative was not the denial of the difficulties, but the reorientation of the self toward a Father who was already aware of the needs, was already providing for the ravens and the grass and the wildflowers, and had given his children a far stronger claim on his care than any of these. The single eye, the single master, the undivided heart organized around a single ultimate loyalty. Seek the kingdom first. And the man on the hillside, who had been speaking since he sat down without any indication of hurrying toward a conclusion, turned to the final portion of what he had come to say. The crowd had heard the Beatitudes redefine who was blessed. They had heard salt and light redefine what they were in the world. They had heard the law affirmed, and then pressed deeper than it had ever been pressed, 6 times, into the interior territory where external observance could not reach. They had heard the 3 central acts of Jewish devotion examined for the corruption of audience and found wanting when performed for the wrong witness. They had heard the Lord's Prayer as a model of what genuine conversation with the Father looked like. They had heard the teaching on treasure and anxiety, and the single eye, and the two masters, and the lilies that outclothe Solomon. They had been sitting on the grass for a sustained period, longer than any synagogue address most of them had attended, and the man who had been speaking had shown no sign of reaching a natural resting point. He was not building toward a peroration. He was building toward something else, a series of warnings and then a parable and then a silence. What came next had the quality of a man turning toward his audience with something he had been saving, not because the previous material was less important, but because these final teachings had a specific function. They were the mirror held up to the hearers. They were the moment when the sermon stopped describing the kingdom and started asking what kind of person was sitting on the grass listening to the description of it. "Do not judge," he said, "so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you." The sentence has been quoted so widely and so variously across 2,000 years that it has accumulated a kind of ambient fog of meaning. Used to mean everything from "do not criticize anyone for anything," to remain neutral on every moral question, to mind your own business. None of these is what Jesus said, and the evidence that none of them is what he meant is embedded in the passage that immediately follows, which requires exactly the discernment that a prohibition of all judgment would make impossible. You cannot identify pearls or identify the people before whom they should not be cast without a capacity for evaluation. You cannot recognize false prophets by their fruit without the ability to distinguish good fruit from bad. The sermon that closes with these warnings could not simultaneously forbid the discernment they require. The word krino, judge, carried in its primary sense the meaning of a judicial verdict, the pronouncement of a final determination about a person's standing, the delivery of the kind of sentence that belonged to the courts of law, and, in the ultimate case, to the court of God. The person who was being addressed in this warning was not the person who had noticed that their neighbor was doing something wrong. The person being addressed was the one who had appointed themselves the arbiter of their neighbor's final standing before God, who had moved from observation to verdict, who had looked at another person and delivered the kind of judgment that the sermon had already located in the divine domain alone. When Jesus had described calling someone a fool as liable to the fire of Gehenna, the offense was precisely this: the usurpation of the divine role as judge of human souls. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. The reciprocal was not described as vengeance or punishment. It was a description of a moral reality that operated as reliably as the seed and harvest principle. The person who applied a particular standard to others would find that standard applied to them, and they would not meet it any more successfully than the person they had been judging. The measure you use. The word metron pointed to the measuring instrument, the yardstick, the unit by which you determined whether something was sufficient. Whatever measuring instrument you used for other people, that same instrument would be used for you. The person who measured others with the most demanding standard had elected to be measured by that standard themselves, and the standard was the one that the sermon had been describing all morning, the standard no one on the hillside had yet met. "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye?" he continued, "but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? And how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye?" The Greek words made the contrast almost physically absurd. Karphos, the speck, the sliver, the tiny piece of chaff or straw that might drift into an eye in the course of ordinary outdoor life in an agricultural community, almost invisible, requiring very gentle and precise attention to remove safely. And dokos, the beam, the architectural timber, the roofing member that bore the weight of a structure, a piece of wood large enough to furnish the fabric of a building. A man walking around with a roofing beam in his eye, attempting to perform delicate ocular microsurgery on his neighbor, was an image of such physical comedy that it must have produced at least some laughter from the crowd on the hillside, the kind of laughter that arrives a beat before the recognition that one is laughing at oneself. The image was not designed to suggest that the speck in the brother's eye was not real or did not need attention. The closing line of the teaching made the opposite point explicitly. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. First deal with the log. The goal of dealing with the log is not to leave the brother with his speck indefinitely. The goal is to see clearly enough to be genuinely useful. The person who has not dealt with the log in their own eye is not a person capable of performing the delicate operation the brother needs. They are too impaired by their own condition to navigate someone else's. And the combination of impaired vision and confident diagnosis was, in the world Jesus was describing, the condition of the person who had appointed themselves judge, certain of the speck's location and nature, while entirely unaware of the beam in their own eye that was doing the looking. The word hypocrite landed here for the second time in the sermon, and it had the same theatrical texture it had carried in the section on religious performance. The person whose public face, in this case, the face of the concerned and corrective friend, did not match the interior reality of their own condition. The hypocrite was not necessarily a cynic or a deliberate deceiver. They might have been entirely sincere in their desire to help the brother with the speck. The problem was that sincerity was not sufficient equipment for the task. Clear vision was required, and clear vision required first attending to what was obstructing it. Do not give dogs what is holy, or throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. The image arrived without introduction or context, as though it were obvious, and it was. In the Jewish taxonomy, dogs and pigs were both unclean animals, the dog ranging the streets as a scavenger, the pig a byword for ritual pollution. The holy things, the things set apart for God, were not to be profaned by contact with the unclean. The pearls before pigs was an image of such obvious futility that it barely required elaboration. Pigs cannot eat pearls, cannot appreciate their worth, will trample them without noticing what they are trampling, and if startled or angered in the process, will turn on the person who threw the things at them. The teaching stood in apparent tension with the love of enemies and the indiscriminate generosity of the Father who sent rain on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. The resolution was in understanding that the teaching was not about persons, but about readiness. There were people, in particular states of heart and mind, whose capacity to receive particular things was simply not present at that moment, and the attempt to force the offering into the hands of someone not yet capable of receiving it would produce not transformation, but destruction, the trampling underfoot of something precious, and the turning of the trampler against the one who had offered it. The discernment required was not about categorizing people permanently as dogs and pigs, as irrecoverable, and therefore not worth the effort. It was about reading the state of readiness in a given moment and calibrating the offering accordingly. It was also, quietly, a warning about the sermon itself. These teachings, which the crowd was hearing now for the first time, were not things that could be hurled at every situation and every person and every moment without attention to the ground they were landing on. The Beatitudes required a hearing heart. The teaching on the pure heart required a willingness to look at one's own interior. The love of enemies required a person already convinced that they had been loved when they were enemies. None of these things were self-evidently receivable by everyone in every state. The offering required wisdom about the offering, and wisdom about the one being offered to, and acquiring that wisdom was the work of the clear eye that had first dealt with its own beam. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. The three verbs in the Greek were all in the present imperative, the continuous tense. Keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Not a single request that would be granted or denied and then settled. The ongoing practice of asking, the persistence that did not assume that a single unanswered request was the final word. The three verbs also described three different intensities of engagement. Asking was the most basic, the verbal request. Seeking was active and directional, moving toward what one did not yet have. Knocking was the most physically committed, the direct address to a door that stood between the person and what was on the other side. The three together described a sustained, multi-dimensional engagement with the Father that did not reduce to a single transaction. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? The word translated as evil, poneros, was the same word that had appeared as the bad eye and the evil one throughout the sermon. Jesus was not describing the disciples as wicked in some dramatic sense. He was observing that even ordinary human fathers, imperfect and flawed as all human fathers were, as subject to poneros in its various registers as anyone else in the crowd, still managed to give bread when their children asked for bread, and fish when they asked for fish. The basic instinct of the parent toward the child's genuine need survived the general imperfection of the human condition. And the Father in heaven, who was not subject to poneros in any of its registers, who was the source of all the goodness that human fathers managed to express in their imperfect provision, would give good things to those who asked him with an incomparably greater reliability and generosity than the best human parent had ever managed. The argument from earthly parental love to divine provision arrived here as the final application of the Kal Vahomer reasoning that had structured the ravens and the lilies, from the lesser to the greater, from the imperfect to the perfect, from the flawed human expression of the thing to its infinite divine original. And it provided the theological grounding for the ask, seek, knock instruction. The asking was not a shot in the dark, not a prayer offered to a God whose response was genuinely uncertain, not the religious equivalent of a wishing well. It was the request of a child to a father whose disposition toward the child was already established and whose provision was already in motion. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. The sentence arrived at the precise center of the sermon's ethical structure, the place where everything that had come before it converged, and the place from which everything after it would depart. It has been called the Golden Rule by commentators for centuries, and the name stuck partly because the rule itself was so broadly recognized. Versions of it appeared in Confucius and in the Stoics. In the Talmud attributed to Hillel, who had said that everything else in the Torah was commentary on this, in the ethical traditions of cultures that had no contact with the Jewish scriptures. The negative form of the rule, do not do to others what you would not want done to you, appeared across these traditions as a baseline of ethical reciprocity, recognized almost wherever human beings organized themselves into communities and had to work out how to treat one another. Jesus stated it positively, and the positive form was more demanding than the negative in precisely the way that the love of enemies had been more demanding than the mere restraint of violence. The negative form required only the cessation of harmful action, while the positive form required the initiation of beneficial action. Not merely do not harm others as you would not be harmed, but actively do for others what you would want done for you. Not the restraint of the impulse to take, but the exercise of the impulse to give. Not the withholding of the blow, but the turning toward the other, with the kind of generous attention you wished someone would turn toward you. And then, for this is the law and the prophets. These 5 words were the structural linchpin of the entire sermon, because the sermon had begun with exactly this claim, that Jesus had not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. The beginning had announced the fulfillment. This sentence, at the hinge between the sermon's ethical teaching and its closing warnings, declared what the fulfillment consisted of. The law was not a collection of arbitrary requirements. The prophets were not a series of disconnected divine utterances. Together, they were the attempt, across centuries and circumstances, to describe in specific commands and specific narratives what it looked like to treat others as one would wish to be treated. The gleaning laws and the Sabbath rest, and the prohibition on taking the cloak overnight in the year of Jubilee, and the love of neighbor and the care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger, all of it was an extended, historically conditioned, culturally specific elaboration of this sentence, and this sentence was the interior principle that made the elaboration intelligible. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. The image of two ways was ancient in the tradition. Psalm 1 had set the pattern at the opening of the entire Psalter. The way of the righteous and the way of the wicked, one leading to flourishing and one leading to perishing. Deuteronomy had placed before Israel two possibilities, life and death, blessing and curse, and had urged with urgency the choice of life. The book of Proverbs had made the two ways one of its central metaphors, the way of wisdom and the way of folly, each with its advocates and its destinations. By the time Jesus reached for the image, it was familiar to every person on the hillside from childhood. What he added to the familiar image was something that the tradition had not always said so plainly. The wide way was more traveled. Many entered by the wide gate. The easy path had the majority of foot traffic. This was not a statement of comfortable resignation. It was a description of the actual structure of the human condition as the sermon had been presenting it throughout. The wide way was wide precisely because it accommodated the self as it naturally arrived, the self that wanted to accumulate earthly treasure, that organized its interior life around the defense of material provision, that judged others without first dealing with its own beam, that performed its religion for the watching human audience, that said, "Lord, Lord," without the interior transformation that the address implied. All of this was easy in the sense that it required no fundamental reorganization of the self. It was the path of least resistance from the starting point of ordinary human experience. The narrow way was narrow because the thing it required was the thing the sermon had been describing all morning, the poverty of spirit that had no store of self-sufficiency to rely on, the meekness that had surrendered the drive for self-assertion, the purity of heart that had no competing allegiance to harbor, the love of enemies that had no room for the natural human preference, for the deserving over the undeserving, the undivided eye that could not simultaneously look at earthly treasure and heavenly treasure without losing focus on both. These were not things that happened easily. They were not things that happened automatically. They were not, the sermon implied, things that happened at all through human effort alone, which was the weight behind the whole sequence. The standard was higher than the Pharisees, higher than anything the law's external application could produce, and the path toward it was correspondingly narrow and correspondingly difficult to find. Those who find it are few, not a comfortable statement, and not intended to be, not a tribal boast from the few about the many they had managed to surpass. A plain description of the actual difficulty of the thing being described, delivered without sentimentality and without false reassurance that most people were probably finding it just fine. Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. The false prophet was a recognized figure in the Hebrew tradition, a figure of genuine theological danger, someone who claimed to speak for God while directing people away from God, whose persuasiveness was real, and whose error was lethal precisely because it arrived dressed as truth. Deuteronomy had provided a test for the false prophet. If what they predicted did not come to pass, they were speaking presumptuously and need not be feared. But the more dangerous figure was the one whose predictions might happen to be accurate, while their fundamental teaching led people away from the covenant. The test by fulfillment was not sufficient against that kind of false prophet. Something else was required. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? The questions were rhetorical. Of course not. The thorn bush and the thistle were incapable of producing grapes and figs. Not because they were choosing not to, not because of any deficiency of will or effort, but because what they produced was determined by what they were. The production of the plant was not separable from the nature of the plant. You knew the plant by its produce, not by its appearance during the off-season when nothing was growing, not by what it claimed to be, not by how much like a vine or a fig tree it happened to look while standing in the field. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. The healthy and diseased in this sentence were kalos and sapros, the beautiful, good, and the rotten. The sapros tree was not merely underperforming. It was rotten at its center, decayed at the root, and the decay would eventually show itself in the fruit regardless of how the surface appeared. The false prophet was not primarily a fraud in the deliberate sense, not necessarily a person who knew they were deceiving and had cynically decided to do so for personal gain. They might have been, and frequently were, someone whose center was sapros while their surface was genuinely impressive. Someone who had built a large and visible religious structure on a foundation that would not support it, who had accumulated the markers of divine endorsement without the interior transformation that genuine endorsement required. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire, the consequence announced without mitigation, without a softening qualifier about the possibilities of rehabilitation. The assessment of fruit was not suspended indefinitely. It was coming, and when it came, it would be decisive. The image of fire connected to the grass thrown into the oven, and to the Gehenna of the anger antithesis, the thing that had failed at its essential function, was removed from the place where it had been standing and repurposed in a way that bore no resemblance to what it was supposed to have been. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. The shift from third-person false prophets to first-person I was abrupt and significant. Jesus moved from describing the category of false prophets in general to making a claim about himself specifically. The judgment of who entered the kingdom was his to render, and the rendering would not be based on the vocabulary of address or the impressiveness of the religious activities conducted in his name. The Lord, Lord of this verse was not the address of people who had rejected Jesus or who had never heard of him. It was the address of people who had organized their religious lives around him, who had spoken his name as the authorization for their activities, who had believed themselves to be operating in his cause and under his authority. On that day, many will say to me, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?" The works were not trivial. Prophecy, exorcism, mighty works. These were the highest expressions of religious power recognized in the tradition, the kinds of activities that would have made the people performing them significant religious figures in any first-century community. The crowd on the hillside had probably encountered people whose claim to religious authority rested on exactly these kinds of activities. The works were real. The power was real in some sense. The name being invoked was real. And then will I declare to them, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness." The words landed on the hillside like something falling from a height. I never knew you. Not, I knew you once, and you have since drifted away from what you were. Not, I know you, but am disappointed by what you have become. Never. The knowing had never been established. The relationship that the address, Lord, implied, the intimate knowing of the Father who saw in secret, the hesed that held its object in a bond of personal commitment, the knowing that went both ways between the one who prayed and the one who heard. This had never existed between them, despite the prophecies and the exorcisms and the mighty works, despite the years of religious activity performed in his name. The activities had filled the years. The relationship had not filled the heart. Workers of lawlessness, ergazomenoi ten anomian, those who had been working at the thing that was without law, without the nomos, without the deep alignment with the law's interior principle that the sermon had been describing. The irony was precise and terrible. These were not people who had ostentatiously broken the commandments. They were people who had built what looked, from the outside and perhaps from the inside, like a comprehensive religious life. And the life, for all its impressive external architecture, had not been built from the thing that the law in its fulfillment required: the poverty of spirit, the purity of heart, the single eye, the undivided loyalty, the interior transformation of the self by the grace of the Father that produced the righteousness exceeding the Pharisees from the inside rather than performing it for an audience from the outside. This was the most severe moment in a sermon that had not lacked for severity, and it came precisely here at the end, as the definitive diagnosis of what the wide gate and the easy way actually looked like in their most religious form. The wide way was not primarily the way of the flagrantly immoral. It was the way of the impressively religious, whose religion had remained on the surface of their lives, who had performed the prophecy and the exorcism and the mighty works without the interior ground those activities were supposed to grow from. The chilling word was never, because never meant that no amount of subsequent effort could retroactively establish what had not been established. The knowing that went both ways, the relationship that the Father's side had always been open to, and the human side had consistently bypassed in favor of the activities performed in place of it. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. The parable arrived at the exact right moment. After the most severe warning in the sermon, after the "I never knew you" that had stripped the landscape of every comfortable assumption about religious performance, the parable offered not reassurance, but instruction. This is the difference between the two destinations, the two ways, the two gates, the two trees, the two kinds of person who will stand before him saying, "Lord, Lord," hearing and doing, versus hearing and not doing. The wise builder was not a remarkable person in any of the ways that the sermon had been addressing. They had not performed exorcisms or prophesied or done mighty works. They had heard these words of mine, the specific words of this specific sermon, spoken by this specific man sitting on this specific hillside, and they had done them. Not admired them, not agreed with them, not found them inspiring or profound or ethically impressive. Done them. The doing was the foundation, and the foundation was rock, and the rock was what the building required when the weather changed. In the geography of Palestine, the seasonal rains that came in the late autumn and winter were genuine and serious. The wadis, the dry riverbeds that crossed the landscape, carried no water through the long, dry summer and became treacherous torrents in the rainy season. A builder who chose the convenience of a sandy wadi bed for their site in summer, when the ground was easy to level and the location seemed perfectly suitable, would find in winter that they had built in the path of everything the rain was going to send their way. A builder who chose the harder work of a rocky outcrop, who spent more time and effort on a foundation that the rock demanded, would find when the rain came that the thing they had built would hold. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. The foolish builder was not the person who had rejected the sermon, or dismissed it, or never heard it. The foolish builder had heard it, had sat on the hillside, perhaps, from the Beatitudes, all the way through to this parable, had nodded and wondered, and been occasionally struck by something and gone home, and made no change to the architecture of their interior life, had treated the sermon as a presentation to be received and appreciated rather than a demolition order for the existing structure and a blueprint for what should replace it. The house looked, to anyone passing by during the dry season, exactly like the wise man's house. The same walls, the same roof, the same general dimensions. The difference between them was entirely in the foundation, entirely underground, entirely invisible until the weather came. Great was the fall of it. The collapse of a substantial structure built on insufficient ground was not a quiet event. The greater the edifice, the more catastrophic the failure. And the person who had heard the longest sermon most of them had ever sat through, who had heard the Beatitudes and the antitheses and the Lord's Prayer, and the teaching on treasure and anxiety, and the narrow way and the false prophets and the terrible words, "I never knew you," who had gathered all of this hearing into a structure that looked from the outside like a life shaped by the sermon, and who had not done the work of the foundation, that person's fall, when the flood came, would be proportionate to what they had assembled on the sand. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Matthew's word for astonished, exaplisanto, was the word for being struck out of one's ordinary condition by the force of an external impact, displaced from one's normal cognitive position by something too large or too unexpected to be simply absorbed and integrated and moved on from. They were, in the precise sense of the word, struck. The sermon had hit them somewhere that the usual rhythm of synagogue instruction did not reach. They had heard teaching before. They had heard the scribes expound the Torah with all the apparatus of their tradition, the citations, the precedents, the careful navigation of one authority against another, the weight of the received interpretation deployed with skill and scholarship. This had not been that. He was teaching them as one who had authority. The authority was not charisma, not the authority of the confident public speaker who fills a room with the force of their personality. It was something more specific and more disturbing, the authority of a person who was speaking from inside the thing they were describing, who held what they were saying, not as a received interpretation they were faithfully transmitting, but as a truth they possessed from the inside and were releasing from their own position. The scribes taught with the authority of tradition. This man taught with the authority of someone who, apparently, was the tradition's source rather than its interpreter. You have heard it said, but I say to you, 6 times over, in his own name, as though his own name were sufficient. The crowd's astonishment was not agreement. Matthew does not say they understood it or received it or immediately went home and did it. He says they were astonished, which is the honest thing to say, because the honest response to the sermon was astonishment. The Beatitudes alone were astonishing. The reversal of every social expectation about who was blessed. The 6 antitheses were astonishing, the demand that went behind the external act to the interior origin and found the murder inside the anger and the adultery inside the cultivated gaze. The Lord's Prayer was astonishing in its simplicity and its depth, its yes and no honesty in a world of elaborate religious performance. The lilies were astonishing, the wildflowers outclothing the legendary magnificence of Solomon. The narrow gate was astonishing, the admission that the easy path was more traveled, and the "I never knew you" was the most astonishing thing of all. The warning dressed in the clothing of the very religious tradition whose practitioners had assumed they were safest. The sermon was finished. He stood up, or perhaps he did not. The text does not specify the conclusion of his seated posture, only the conclusion of his words. The crowd dispersed eventually, back to the villages and the fishing boats and the fields and the tax obligations and the complicated daily reality that had not changed while they sat on the hillside and listened. They went back to the world that moth and rust destroyed and thieves broke into. They went back to the world of Roman soldiers and Pharisaic expectations and the perpetual anxiety about tomorrow's provision. They went back carrying something they had not had when they came up the hill, though most of them could not yet have said precisely what it was or what to do with it. What they carried would prove both lighter and heavier than anything else they had ever been given. Lighter, because the burden it described was nothing like the burden of the 613 commandments managed through external compliance. The righteousness it described was not the product of managed compliance at all. It was the outflow of a character formed from the inside, the natural expression of a self that had been reorganized around the kingdom and the Father who provided, and the love that did not stop at the boundary of the neighbor. In one sense, the burden of that was no burden at all. It was the natural expression of what the self, restored to its created design, actually was and actually wanted. And heavier, because arriving at that condition was not a project that could be completed by effort. The poverty of spirit, the purity of heart, the love of enemies. These were not character traits that could be developed through a sufficiently rigorous program of self-improvement. They required the kind of transformation that the sermon had been pointing toward throughout, the kind that the Lord's Prayer was the daily practice of approaching, the kind that the teaching on the two masters was describing as the prerequisite, the kind that neither the Pharisees with all their elaborate observance, nor the prophets and exorcists with all their impressive religious power had managed to manufacture on their own. The demand was total. The resources required to meet it were not available from inside the person being demanded of, which was perhaps the sermon's deepest teaching, the one most thoroughly embedded in its structure rather than its content. The poverty of spirit was the first beatitude because it was the first condition, the recognition that one had nothing to bring, that the emptiness was the beginning, that the approach to the Father began with the acknowledgement of being unable to make the approach on one's own. The whole sermon, from the blessed are the poor in spirit to the great, was the fall of the house built on sand, was a description of something that could not be achieved from a standing start of self-sufficiency. It required the asking, and the seeking, and the knocking. It required the Father who already knew what was needed, and who gave good things to those who asked. 2,000 years have passed since the crowd dispersed from that hillside, and the sermon they left behind has not settled. It has been preached in every language spoken by a sufficient number of Christians to support a church, expounded by scholars whose combined output on its verses would fill a library too large to read in a lifetime. Applied to situations its speaker could not have imagined in a world that would have been unrecognizable to him, reduced to inspirational decoration, elevated to the foundational document of entire political movements, used to justify pacifism and to condemn it, invoked in arguments about economics and poverty and foreign policy and personal morality and the interior life of the individual before God. The Beatitudes have been sentimentalized into comfortable assurances that God loves the unfortunate, removing the force that made them astonishing. The claim that the unfortunate are already the possessors of the kingdom, not the eventual recipients of a consolation prize. The command to love enemies has been carefully restricted by every generation to personal enemies rather than political ones, because the personal application is merely difficult, while the political application is practically ruinous for every earthly interest. The teaching on anxiety has been repackaged as stress management advice for people who find the theological grounding inconvenient. The warning about the wide gate and the narrow way has served as a tribal marker for every group convinced that it was among the few while the many crowded the other path. And yet, the sermon has kept escaping its misreadings with a persistence that amounts to something. Something in it refuses to be fully domesticated, to be finally settled into a comfortable shape that asks nothing of the reader. The Beatitudes keep producing the shock of the original inversion for new readers who arrive without the accumulated weight of the tradition. The love of enemies keeps refusing to mean something more comfortable than love of enemies. The I never knew you keeps arriving with its cold clarity at the end of the most religious chapters in people's lives, the moment when the impressive structure meets the flood, and the question of the foundation becomes the only question. The speck and the plank keeps identifying its reader somehow in the same moment as its subject. The crowd that dispersed from the hillside that day had been astonished. 2,000 years of reading has not resolved the astonishment into something more manageable. The sermon that began with the poor in spirit and ended with a house falling into a flood has not yet found the bottom of what it is asking, and the people who come to it expecting to find the bottom come away carrying, instead, the beginning of a longer reckoning than they had planned on beginning. The man on the hillside sat down. He opened his mouth. He has not yet, in any sense that matters, finished speaking.